Victor Kane didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Blackwood Ranch's front office swung open hard enough to crack against the wall, and he walked in like the room already belonged to him. Boots loud on the floorboards, hat still on his head, two men behind him who hadn't been invited either. Ethan Blackwood looked up from his desk. Kane dropped a folded document in front of him without a word, let it sit there, and then smiled the kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. "Sign it today," Kane said, "or I'll make sure you don't have a ranch left to argue about by spring." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked back out, and his men followed, and the door didn't close behind them. That was the moment everything changed. Not just for Ethan Blackwood, but for the woman who had arrived at his ranch 3 weeks earlier with a worn leather bag, a letter of recommendation she'd written mostly herself, and the quiet, absolute certainty that she had nothing left to lose. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, if you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye decide something about you before you opened your mouth, then you already know something about Claire Whitmore. Stay with this story. Like this video, drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what Claire did after that door swung shut, that's where this story really begins. The morning Claire Whitmore arrived in Harlan Creek, Montana, the sky was the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming. She stepped off the stagecoach at 7:30 with her bag in one hand and a folded advertisement in the other, and the first thing she noticed was that 3 men standing outside the feed store stopped their conversation to look at her. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. She'd been looked at that way before. It was a particular kind of looking, the sort that measures and dismisses at the same time, that takes in a woman's age and her clothing and her unaccompanied state and arrives at a conclusion before a single word has been exchanged. Claire was 29 years old. She had dark brown hair she kept pinned back because loose hair was impractical, and she had the kind of face that other women sometimes called striking and men sometimes called trouble, though neither description had ever felt accurate to her. She was simply a person trying to get from one day to the next, which was more complicated than it sounded. She tucked the advertisement back into her coat pocket and asked the stage driver where she might find a meal before the ranch wagon came to collect her. "Mabel's," he said, pointing up the main street without looking at her. "Tell her Henry sent you. She'll give you the corner table." She didn't tell Mabel that Henry sent her. She sat at whatever table was available and ordered coffee and 2 eggs, and ate quickly, because she had learned that eating quickly in unfamiliar places gave people less time to ask questions she didn't want to answer. The woman who owned the place, presumably Mabel herself, though she never said so, refilled Claire's coffee without being asked and lingered a moment too long. "You the one going up to Blackwood?" she asked. Claire looked up. "I am." Mabel made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disapproval. It occupied a middle space that Claire recognized as the sound people make when they want to say something and have decided against it. "He's had 3 housekeepers in the past 2 years, Mabel said finally. Each one lasted a few months. What happened to them?" "Nothing happened to them. They left." She wiped the counter with a cloth that wasn't clean. "Man's difficult. Not cruel, mind you. Just difficult." Claire wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The warmth of it was the most comforting thing she'd felt in 3 days. "I'm not easily discouraged," she said. Mabel gave her the look again, the one that measured. And this time it felt slightly different, not dismissive, almost respectful. "No," she said. "I suppose you aren't." The wagon arrived at 9:30, driven by a ranch hand named Gus, who was approximately 60 years old, missing the tip of his left index finger, and not interested in conversation. That was fine with Claire. She sat beside him on the bench and watched the landscape open up as they left town. The way the flat scrubland gradually gave way to rolling hills. The way the hills eventually suggested something larger behind them. The way the road deteriorated from packed dirt to something that felt more like suggestion than infrastructure. "How many people work the ranch?" she asked, about 40 minutes in. Gus considered the question as though it were more complicated than it appeared. "Depends on the season. 30 head of workers in summer, maybe 18 in winter." He paused. "Plus the house staff, but that's mostly just you now." "Just me?" "Last girl left in October. Before that, the one before her." Claire nodded and said nothing further, and Gus seemed satisfied with this arrangement. When Blackwood Ranch came into view, her first thought was that the advertisement had undersold it considerably. The main house was 3 stories of dressed timber and river stone, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front face and windows that caught the flat winter light and threw it back doubled. Behind it, visible at a distance, were the outbuildings: barn, bunkhouse, a long, low structure she guessed was storage, and beyond everything else, the land itself, pressing out in every direction farther than she could see the end of. She had not expected to feel anything particular at the sight of it. She was here for work. She needed the wages and the roof and the distance from her previous life, in roughly that order. What she felt instead, looking at that house against that sky, was something she couldn't quite name, something between recognition and warning, as though the place were trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. Ethan Blackwood was standing on the porch when the wagon pulled up. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she'd expected. The advertisement had said ranch owner, which covered a considerable range. What she saw was a man of about 35 or 36, broad through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had weathered more than sun. He was wearing a work coat over a flannel shirt, and he looked like he'd been outdoors since before dawn, which he probably had. He was watching her without pretending not to. When Gus stopped the wagon, Ethan came down the porch steps and picked up her bag from the back before she'd had the chance to reach for it herself. "You traveled a long way," he said. Not a question. He handed the bag to no one, simply held it, and looked at her directly. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch." It was such an ordinary thing to say. She'd spent 3 weeks bracing herself for the moment of arrival, the inevitable sizing up, the doubt barely concealed behind politeness, the careful inspection of her qualifications and her appearance and her history. Instead, this man she'd never met picked up her luggage and said welcome and meant it in the straightforward way people mean it when they're too tired for performance. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Claire Whitmore." "I know," he said. "Come inside. I'll show you the kitchen first." The kitchen was the largest room in the house and the most neglected. This became clear to her within about 30 seconds of stepping into it, not because it was filthy, but because it had the particular disorder of a space that had been functional once and had slowly, incrementally stopped being managed. The stores were disorganized. The inventory was kept in a ledger that hadn't been updated in at least 2 months. There were supplies she could see that were past their useful date, and gaps where supplies should have been and weren't. She didn't say any of this out loud. She looked, and she filed it away. And she listened while Ethan explained the schedule and the workers' meal times and what was expected of her. "The men eat at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening," he said. "The house meals are separate. I generally eat whenever the work allows, which isn't always on schedule." He paused. The previous housekeepers found that arrangement difficult. "I'm adaptable," Claire said. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the distinct impression he was trying to decide whether she meant it or was simply saying what the situation required. She held his gaze without particular effort. She was telling the truth. Adaptability had been the difference between surviving the past 2 years and not surviving them, and she had learned to treat it less like a quality she possessed and more like a discipline she practiced. "All right," he said, and showed her to her room. The room was at the back of the house, off the kitchen corridor, small, simply furnished, with a window that faced east and a radiator that worked intermittently. It was more than she'd had in several months, and she didn't say this, but she stood in the middle of it for a moment after he left and felt something unclench in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. She unpacked her bag. She changed into her working clothes. She went back to the kitchen and started taking stock of what was there. The first week was a study in people watching her to see when she would fail. She understood this, and she didn't resent it. She'd learned long ago that resentment was a weight you carried for the benefit of the people who'd given it to you, which was a bad trade. The cowboys who came through the kitchen for meals looked at her with the particular mix of skepticism and wariness that men develop around women they can't categorize. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't family. She wasn't one of them. She was somewhere in between all of those things, and they hadn't decided yet what that meant. She fed them well. That was the beginning of everything. The first change she made was to the bread. The previous arrangement had apparently involved buying bread from town, which arrived twice a week in varying states of freshness and cost more per loaf than it should have. Claire began baking on the second day. By the end of the first week, the men had started arriving at meals slightly ahead of schedule, which was the most obvious indicator she had that something had shifted. The second change was to the evening meal. The portions had been adequate but not generous, which was false economy. Men doing physical labor in cold weather need more calories than a counting house clerk, and underfed workers made mistakes, and mistakes on a ranch were expensive. She increased the portions and adjusted the cost by eliminating the waste she'd found in the stores, and the numbers evened out without difficulty. The third change was harder to explain because it wasn't about food at all. She started learning names. Not just the names, the specifics. Which of the younger hands was saving money and why? Which of the older ones had a knee that gave him trouble in the cold? Which man ate quickly because he was shy, and which one ate slowly because he was? She didn't do anything obvious with this information. She simply had it, and sometimes it meant she set a cup of coffee closer to the man whose hands were stiff, or kept a portion warm for the one who always came in late from the far pastures. It cost her nothing. It wasn't a strategy. It was simply what you did when you paid attention to people. What she didn't expect was for Ethan Blackwood to notice. He came into the kitchen on a Thursday evening, later than usual, past 8 o'clock, and found her at the table going over the supply ledger she'd been working to reconstruct. He stopped just inside the doorway. "You're still working," he said. "There are some discrepancies in the inventory records going back to September," she said, without looking up immediately. "I want to understand them before I start placing orders." He pulled a chair out and sat down across from her without being invited, which she registered but didn't comment on. He looked at the ledger, which was covered in her corrections in a different ink. "Ned kept those records," he said. "My head manager." "I know, some of the entries are perfectly accurate. The issue is that several of the supply purchases don't match the actual consumption figures I've been tracking." She turned the ledger to show him. "We were being charged for quantities we weren't receiving." The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. She'd seen it before. The silence of a person recalibrating something they thought they understood. "How much?" he asked. "I'd estimate somewhere between 15 and 20% of the dry goods budget over the past quarter. I need another week to be certain." Ethan looked at the ledger for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Ned's worked for this ranch for 11 years. "I know," she said, "which is why I want to be certain before I say anything further." He didn't respond immediately. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wind coming off the high ground to the north and working its way through every gap in the house it could find. The radiator in the corner ticked. "How do you know how to read those figures?" he asked. It was a fair question, though the phrasing of it, the slight edge of surprise, told her something about what he'd assumed. She decided to answer it directly. "My husband owned a hardware supply business in Ohio," she said. "I kept the books for 7 years. When he died, I understood the business better than anyone, but the creditors weren't interested in my understanding. They were interested in the debt." She closed the ledger. "I left Ohio with what I could carry." Another silence. This one was different, softer at the edges. "I'm sorry about your husband," Ethan said. He said it without the particular careful weight that people sometimes gave those words, as though they were expensive and had to be handled properly. He said it the way you'd say it to someone who had told you a fact about their life, which was exactly what it was. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it more than she usually did. She found the trouble with Ned Carver on the following Tuesday. She hadn't gone looking for a confrontation. She'd gone looking for a specific purchase order from early October, which she needed to complete the ledger reconstruction, and she'd gone to the storage room off the barn where the older records were kept. She was in there for about 20 minutes before she found what she was looking for, and then found, tucked behind it, something she wasn't looking for at all: a second set of records. Not official ranch records, personal notes in Carver's handwriting, logging the difference between what was ordered and what was delivered, and next to each entry, a small mark that she quickly understood was a division notation. Someone else was splitting the difference with him. She stood in that cold storage room for a long moment, holding the papers, aware of how this was going to go. She had enough experience with situations of this kind to know that the person who found the evidence was rarely thanked for finding it, particularly if they were the newest person in the room, and particularly if they were a woman. She also knew that if she didn't do something with what she'd found, she was going to have to live with having done nothing, which had always been harder for her than whatever difficulty came from acting. She took the papers inside. She made copies in her own hand, careful and complete. She put the originals back exactly where she'd found them and returned to the kitchen and thought, carefully, about what to do next. She brought it to Ethan the next morning before the 6 o'clock meal when the house was still quiet. She put the copies on the table in front of him with the supply ledger open beside them and explained what she'd found and how she'd found it and what she believed it meant. She spoke for about 4 minutes without interruption. When she finished, Ethan looked at the papers for a long time without speaking. The muscle along his jaw worked once, tightened, released. 11 years, he said quietly. I know. He has a family. I know that too. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her. She waited. She'd learned that people sometimes needed a moment with information like this, needed to feel the shape of it before they could respond to it sensibly. What did you do with the originals? He asked. Left them where I found them. I thought you should decide what to do with them. He turned around. He was studying her in a way he hadn't before, not with suspicion, but with something more serious than that, something that was trying to understand her. Why? He asked. You could have taken them directly to the authorities. Because it's your ranch, she said simply. And you've been good to me, and I didn't know what else might be caught up in it that you'd want to handle privately. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, How long have you known? I've suspected since the second week. I wanted to be certain. A short exhale, set. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. He sat back down at the table and put his hands flat on it. Most of the people I've hired in the past 3 years have told me what they thought I wanted to hear, he said. You didn't do that. No. Why not? She considered the question honestly. Because it wouldn't have helped you, she said. But Ned Carver was gone by the end of the week. Ethan handled it quietly, the way he handled most things. Not with drama, but with a kind of deliberate finality that left little room for argument. The man on the other end of the arrangement turned out to be a supplier in Billings, and that relationship was ended as well, and the ranch's procurement shifted to 2 different vendors in different towns, which distributed the risk considerably. Word got around, as word always did on a ranch where 30 men were living in close proximity. What got around wasn't the exact details. Ethan was careful about what he said and to whom, but the general shape of it, which was that the new housekeeper had found something nobody else had found, and the boss had acted on it. The change in how the men treated her was subtle but real. Not dramatic. Nobody made speeches. But the quality of the silences was different. The looks in the corridor were different. The way a few of the older hands started saying good morning when they came through for meals, rather than simply arriving and eating, that was different. She didn't let herself feel too settled by it. She knew how these things went. A place could feel like solid ground right up until it wasn't, and she'd learned not to trust the feeling of solidity anymore, only the actual daily work of building it. Ethan started coming to the kitchen in the evenings more regularly. At first she thought he was checking on things, the inventory, the records, the various small operational details she'd been working through. Then she realized he wasn't checking on anything. He was simply there. He'd sit at the table with a cup of coffee. He didn't always finish, and he'd ask her something about the supply situation, about one of the workers she'd mentioned in passing, about what she thought of a particular decision he was weighing. He asked her opinion the way you ask someone's opinion when you actually want to hear it, rather than when you want confirmation. She was careful about this. She was careful about herself specifically, and how she was starting to feel in the kitchen in the evenings when he was there, and the house had its particular late-night quiet. She had been alone long enough to know that warmth in the right direction could be mistaken for something more specific, and she didn't have any interest in making that mistake. Not here, not again. So she answered his questions clearly and practically. She offered her opinion when he asked for it. She didn't linger over things. And she told herself, with some firmness, that her job was to run the house and manage the supplies and find the ways. This ranch was quietly bleeding money and help stop them, and that was what she would focus on. This was working reasonably well until the afternoon she walked into the stable looking for Gus and found 2 of the younger hands in a disagreement that had progressed from words to the stage just before fists. She stepped between them. She had no plan for doing this. It was simply what her body did, moving forward before she'd finished deciding to. Both men stopped and looked at her with the particular confusion of people who were mid-momentum in a direction they'd been going. Whatever this is, she said, addressing both of them, but looking at neither one in particular, it can wait until after supper. We're short 2 men on the north fence this afternoon, and Gus needs help before the temperature drops. One of them, The younger one, named Pete, who was maybe 19 and always looked like he'd arrived somewhere too fast, started to say something. Pete, she said, just his name, not unkindly. He closed his mouth. She stepped back and let them both pass her and stood in the stable for a moment after they left, aware that her hands were not entirely steady. She pressed them flat against her thighs and waited until they were and went to find Gus. Ethan was in the doorway when she came out of the stable. She wasn't sure how long he'd been there or how much he'd seen. "You could have gotten hurt," he said. "I didn't." "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He was looking at her again with that particular expression, the one she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was trying to understand something he hadn't expected. She found it difficult to look at directly, so she generally looked at a point just to the side of it and hoped he didn't notice. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. She thought about it. "I'm not sure I learned it anywhere," she said. "I think I've just been in enough situations where someone needed to step forward and no one else was going to." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't back down from things." "I back down from plenty of things," she said. "I just try to choose wisely which ones." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Just a small thing, the kind of thing you only catch if you're paying attention. He turned and walked back toward the house, and she went to find Gus, and neither of them said anything further about it. But she thought about it later, at the kitchen table with the ledger in front of her and the radiator ticking beside her and the wind coming off the high ground and working through every gap it could find. She thought about it, and she made herself stop thinking about it, and then she thought about it again anyway, which was the thing that told her she was in more trouble than she'd been prepared for. The evening. Victor Kane's men came to the ranch was cold enough that the ground had frozen solid for the first time that winter, and Claire heard the horses before she saw the lights, because sound carried differently when the soil was hard. She was at the kitchen window and she watched 3 riders come down the approach road and stop at the gate, and she watched Ethan go out to meet them with his coat half on. She couldn't hear what was said. She could see the shape of it, the way Ethan went still and then stiffened, the way the rider in the middle leaned forward slightly, the way the conversation had the particular geometry of a statement being made rather than a negotiation being conducted. One of the riders passed something to Ethan. Then they turned and went back up the road, and the gate creaked in the wind for a while after they were gone. Ethan came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway with the envelope in his hand. His face was the careful, controlled version of his face that she'd come to understand meant he was working to maintain a steadiness he didn't entirely feel. "Who is Victor Kane?" she asked, because she'd heard the name in passing twice in the past month and filed it away without yet understanding its significance. Ethan looked at the envelope. "He owns the 3 Rivers Cattle Company out of Billings, 3 times the size of this operation, half the water rights in the Central Territory." He paused. "He wants ours." "What's in the envelope?" He handed it to her without apparent hesitation, which she understood as a form of trust she wasn't sure she'd earned yet. She read it. It was a purchase offer, legal language, formal and complete, for the water rights to Blackwood Creek, which she'd learned was the source that fed the entire northern pasture system, and without which a substantial portion of the cattle operation would become unsustainable within a season. The offer was below market, significantly below market. "That's not a real offer," she said. "No," Ethan said. "It's a notice." She looked at him. He was watching her read it, and there was something in his expression that was asking a question he hadn't put into words yet. "He'll apply pressure if you refuse," she said. "He's been applying pressure for 6 months. This is the next step." He sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the way a person sits when they've been standing against something for a long time and need a moment of not standing against it. His lawyers have filed 2 nuisance complaints against the ranch this fall. The water claims are older. He's argued his upstream usage predates my father's rights, which isn't true, but proving it is more complicated than it should be. Claire read the offer again, then she read it a 3rd time, more slowly. "What documentation exists for your father's water rights?" she asked. "Some. The original agreements are in the family records. My father kept thorough notes, but they're scattered. It would take time to find everything." "How much time do we have?" He looked at her. "Kane's letter gives 30 days before he files an injunction." The kitchen was quiet. The radiator ticked. The wind pushed at the windows and found no purchase and moved on. Then we should start looking, she said. He was still watching her, still with that expression she couldn't look at directly. This isn't your problem, he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he was giving her the choice, genuinely and without coercion. You've already done more for this ranch than you were hired to do. Whatever happens with Kane, that's not what you signed on for. She set the letter on the table between them. I signed on to run your household, she said. And as far as I can tell, your household is part of your ranch, and your ranch is what Kane is trying to take. She met his eyes, which was harder than it usually was, for reasons she wasn't examining right now. Where are your father's records? He looked at her for a long moment. The East Room, he said. 3rd floor. Nobody's been in there in 5 years. She nodded and stood and picked up the lamp from the counter. Then we should probably start tonight, she said, and she went to find the stairs. The East Room was the kind of room that accumulates the residue of a life. Not neatly, not intentionally, but the way water accumulates in a low place, gradually, without design, until there's more than you expected and no clear accounting for where it came from. There were boxes stacked against every wall, some labeled and some not. And there were ledgers and correspondence and survey maps and documents whose purposes weren't immediately clear. There was also a layer of dust over everything that suggested the 5 years Ethan had said were an accurate estimate. She didn't let the scale of it discourage her. She'd been discouraging herself for 2 years, and she'd gotten tired of it. She started with what was labeled and worked outward from there, sorting as she went, building a system as she built an understanding of what the system needed to contain. Ethan worked beside her without being asked, pulling boxes from the higher shelves and opening them on the floor between them, and neither of them spoke much because there wasn't much to say yet, only things to read and understand and place into categories. At some point past midnight, she found a leather-bound folder tucked behind a stack of correspondence from 1887, and when she opened it and read the first page and then the second page, and then sat very still for a moment reading the third, she said, "Ethan." He looked up from where he was across the room. "Come here," she said. He came and crouched beside her and read what she was reading, and she watched his face change while he read it, watched the careful, controlled expression give way to something less controlled and more human, something that looked like a man who had been carrying a weight, finally being shown that the weight was lighter than he'd been told. "That's his signature," he said, touching the edge of the page. "My father's. And that's the county surveyor's seal. That's real. I'd know that mark anywhere." "And the date," she said. 1879. 14 years before Kane's company was incorporated. He looked at the date. Then he looked at her. He was close enough that she could see that the expression she usually avoided looking at directly was there again, and at this distance and in this lamplight, she couldn't look somewhere else. "How did you know to look for this?" he asked. "I didn't," she said. "I was looking for everything. This was in everything." He didn't say anything. The lamplight moved slightly in a draft from somewhere, and shadows shifted across the stacked boxes and the old correspondence and the maps of a territory she was still learning. Outside, the ground was frozen and the wind had died, and somewhere in the distance something moved through the brush and was gone. "This won't be simple," he said. Even with this, Kane has resources. He'll challenge the document." "I know," she said, "but it exists, and that changes what we're arguing from." She closed the folder carefully. "Everything's harder when you're defending against nothing. This is something." He took the folder from her hands, not abruptly but with a particular care, and held it for a moment. "What made you stay?" he asked. "The night we found out about Ned, you could have walked away from that. It wasn't your problem either." She thought about how to answer honestly. "I'm tired of walking away from things," she said. "I spent 2 years walking away. It didn't make anything better." He nodded slowly. He didn't press it, and she was grateful for that. They stayed in the East Room until nearly 2 in the morning, and by the time they stopped, they had found 3 additional supporting documents. A water registry entry, a county record that corresponded with the folder she'd found, and a letter from the surveyor referencing the original agreement by date and location. Taken together, they were the beginning of something. They were not yet the end of anything. But she'd learned to take beginnings seriously. She'd learned that you couldn't always see where a beginning was going to go, and that the uncertainty wasn't a reason not to start. She carried the lamp down the stairs and left it on the kitchen table, and went to her room at the back of the house. And she stood at the window that faced east for a while before she got into bed, looking at the dark that would eventually become morning. She was still here. That was the thing she came back to. After everything, the loss of her husband and the loss of the business and the loss of the life she'd built and the long, exhausting months of looking for a way to build another, she was still here, in a room she'd earned honestly, in a house where someone had seen her as a person before they'd seen her as anything else. She didn't know what came next. She hadn't known what came next for 2 years, and she'd survived that. She could survive a little more uncertainty. What she knew was this. There were documents on the kitchen table that proved the truth, and there was a man in this house who needed someone to fight alongside him, and she had never in her life been able to watch something that mattered get taken from someone who deserved to keep it, not without doing something about it. That, at least, was consistent. That hadn't changed, no matter how many times walking toward something difficult had cost her. She lay down and pulled the blanket up and listened to the frozen ground settling under the cold, and she thought about where you start when you're starting from the beginning again. You start with what you know is true. You start with the documents in your hand and the person beside you and the problem in front of you, and you do the next right thing, and then the thing after that. That was all she'd ever known how to do. It had never been enough to make everything easy, but it had always been enough to move forward. She closed her eyes, and outside the window the dark held steady, and somewhere past it, morning was already on its way. The documents were still on the kitchen table when Claire came downstairs at 5 the next morning. She hadn't moved them before going to bed, and Ethan hadn't moved them either, and seeing them there in the early dark, the leather folder, the registry entry, the county record, the surveyor's letter, arranged in the order they'd been found, felt like confirmation that the previous night had been real and not the particularly detailed kind of dream she sometimes had about solving problems that weren't actually solvable. She put the coffee on and stood at the window while it heated and watched the sky do what it did in Montana in December, which was lightened so gradually that you couldn't catch the exact moment it stopped being dark. The ground was still frozen. Her breath fogged the glass slightly, and she stepped back from it and went to the table and looked at the documents again, more carefully now, with a rested mind. The leather folder concerned her most, not its contents, its condition. The paper was fragile at the edges, the kind of fragile that came from age and from a room that wasn't climate-controlled and from 5 years of nobody paying attention. If Kane's lawyers challenged the documents, the first thing they'd go after was their integrity, and a document that looked fragile was a document that invited doubt, even if every word in it was sound. She needed to make copies, good copies, careful ones, before anything else happened. She was still standing over the table when Ethan came downstairs. He looked like he'd slept about as well as she had, which was to say, imperfectly. His hair was damp from washing, and his coat wasn't fully buttoned, and he had the expression of a man whose mind had kept working after his body had stopped. He looked at the documents, then at her. "You're up early." "I'm always up early." She moved toward the stove. "Coffee's ready. Sit down." He sat. She poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and sat across from him, which she'd never done before. She always sat to the side or stood, because sitting across felt like something else, felt like a different kind of conversation. This morning she sat across because the documents were between them, and they needed to look at them together. "I want to make copies before anything else," she said. "The originals are fragile. If Kane's people try to argue they've been altered, we don't want to give them any excuse to look at the paper more than they have to." Ethan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "I was thinking the same thing. I can do it today. It'll take most of the morning. I'll need a good lamp and a clean table." "Use the office." She nodded. "The other thing is the surveyor's letter. You said the county surveyor's seal. You know what that mark looks like. Is there anyone in town who would know it too? Someone who was working in the county office in 1879? He thought about this. She watched him think about it, which was a particular thing to watch. He didn't perform the thinking, didn't furrow his brow or stare into the distance. He just went still for a moment and then came back. "There's an older man, Harlan Jessup. He was the county recorder in the 80s. He'd have seen that seal on every official document that came through." He paused. "He doesn't leave his house much these days. He's not well. But he's alive. Last I heard. Then he's someone we can talk to." Ethan looked at her, not with the expression she found difficult to meet, but with something quieter than that. Something that was simply registering her, the fact of her, sitting across from him at his kitchen table at 5 in the morning, with coffee going cold between them, and a problem neither of them had asked for spread out in front of them, like a map of unfamiliar territory. "You've done this before," he said. Not an accusation. More like something he was working out. "Done what?" "Found your way through something complicated, when most people would have stopped looking." She picked up her coffee. "I've had practice," she said. She spent the morning in the office with the documents and a clean sheet of drafting paper she found in the bottom drawer of the desk, making copies in a hand that was careful and unhurried. She wrote slowly on purpose, verifying each word and each figure twice before moving to the next, because the value of a copy was only as good as its accuracy, and accuracy required patience she didn't always feel but had learned to perform until it became real. Halfway through the second document, Pete knocked on the office door. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed he did when he was uncomfortable. He was one of the younger hands, 19, maybe 20, from somewhere in Wyoming he never specified. And he had the particular quality of someone who'd grown up in motion and hadn't yet figured out what to do with stillness. "Gus says the north fence needs 3 new posts before the ground freezes harder," he said. "He wants to know if you need me for anything before noon." "Not before noon," she said without looking up. "After noon, I'll need someone to ride to town. I'm sending a list to the hardware supplier." "I can do that." "I know you can." She finished the sentence she was copying and looked up. He was still in the doorway, hat in hands, not quite leaving. "Is there something else?" He shifted his weight. "I just wanted to... the other day. In the stable." He stopped. "It's done," she said. "I know, but... Pete..." She set down her pen. "I didn't step in because I was angry with you. I stepped in because the work needed doing and the two of you were the only ones available to do it. That's all." She picked the pen back up. "Go help Gus with the fence." He nodded and left, and she heard his boots on the porch boards and then the yard, and then the particular sound of someone walking toward work they understood and could manage. She went back to the documents. The copying took until midday. Ethan rode out to check the northern pasture after breakfast, and didn't come back until early afternoon, and when he did, he had mud on his boots up to the ankle, and the look of a man who'd seen something in the field that he hadn't liked. He came into the kitchen, where she was reviewing the morning's copies against the originals, and stood at the sink washing his hands. "How are the cattle?" she asked, without looking up. "Fine. For now." He dried his hands on the cloth hung by the sink. 3 of the water channels from the creek are running lower than they should be this time of year. She set down the papers. "Cane?" "Don't know yet. Could be seasonal. Could be someone upstream redirecting flow." He came to the table and looked at what she'd been doing. He picked up one of the copies she'd made and compared it to the original, line by line, which she appreciated. "These are good," he said. "They're accurate," she said. "That's different from good." A small sound. Not quite a laugh, but something adjacent. He set the copy down. "Jessup's on the south side of town, off the main road. House with a green roof. I sent word ahead that we'd be coming tomorrow." She nodded. "What did you tell him?" "That I had some old county records I wanted him to look at. I didn't say more than that." "Good." She began stacking the copies carefully. "The less anyone knows about why we're looking, the better, until we know what we actually have." "You don't trust easily," he said. It wasn't a criticism. It was an observation, and it was accurate. "I trust people when they've given me a reason to," she said. "It usually takes some time." He was looking at her again. "How long did it take with me?" She considered being evasive and decided against it because it would have been dishonest, and she didn't have the energy for dishonesty today. "The first week," she said. "You came into the kitchen the second night and ate whatever was left over from the workers' meal without asking for something different. That told me something." He looked slightly caught off guard by this, which was satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. "That told you something?" "It told me you weren't someone who expected performance. You ate what was there because it was there and you were hungry. That's a particular kind of person." She slid the documents into the folder. "I don't always get it right, but that's what I saw." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was calling to someone else across the yard. A working voice, carrying information, nothing urgent. The ordinary sound of the ranch doing what it did. I should tell you something, Ethan said. She waited. My father built this place from nothing. He came here in 1871 with enough money to buy a mule and a season's worth of supplies, and everything after that was 30 years of work. He put his hands flat on the table in the way she'd come to associate with him saying something that mattered. I've spent the last 10 years trying to hold what he built. There have been droughts and market collapses and men who worked for me who didn't do what I needed them to do. I've made bad decisions. I've been not easy to work for, probably. He stopped. I know that, she said. Mabel had told her as much the first morning. I know you know. I just wanted you to understand that when I say I'm grateful for what you found, for all of it, the Ned situation and these documents and the way you've run this house, I mean it without reservation. He paused. That's not something I say often. I believe you, she said. And she did. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, across the folder of documents, and the 2 cups of coffee, and the gap between who they were and what either of them had been prepared for when this arrangement had started. The radiator in the corner ticked. The voices outside the window moved on. Then she picked up the folder and stood and said, I need to speak to Gus about tomorrow's arrangements, and he said, I'll go over the pasture records this afternoon. And they both moved in different directions, which was the correct thing to do, and she knew it, and she did it anyway. Harlan Jessup was 81 years old, and he knew it and didn't seem particularly bothered by the fact. He answered the door himself, in wool trousers and a cardigan that had been repaired in several places with different colored thread, and he looked at Ethan and then at Claire with the specific evaluating look of an elderly person who has lived long enough to assess people quickly and accurately. You're the Blackwood boy, he said to Ethan. I am. You look like your father. Come in, both of you. His house was warm and densely furnished in the way of houses where one person has lived a long time. Every surface carrying something, not cluttered but settled, each object in a position it had occupied for years. He led them to a room at the back that served as a study, with a desk by the window and shelves of ledgers and correspondence that looked, to Claire's eye, extremely well organized. She put the folder on his desk and opened it without preliminary, because he looked like a man who appreciated directness. He put on his glasses and bent over the documents and didn't say anything for several minutes. He read slowly, touching the edges of the paper with a fingertip in what she recognized as a professional habit. He was assessing the paper itself, not just what was written on it. Where did you find these? He asked, not looking up. The east room of the ranch house, Ethan said, in my father's records. You hadn't looked before. I didn't know what to look for before. Jessup turned to the surveyor's letter. He looked at the seal for a long time, then looked up at Claire with an expression that asked a question. Can you verify the county surveyor's mark? She asked him. Already did, he said. That's Alderman's mark. Thomas Alderman, county surveyor, 1877 to 1891. I worked with him for 6 of those years. He tapped the seal once with his fingertip. I'd know this mark in my sleep. Something loosened in Claire's chest that she hadn't realized was tight. Beside her, she felt rather than saw a similar shift in Ethan. Would you be willing to say that in a legal proceeding? She asked. Jessup looked at her. His eyes, behind the glasses, were clear and precise. Depends, he said. Who am I saying it against? Victor Kane. A silence. Jessup took off his glasses and cleaned them on his cardigan sleeve and put them back on. He looked at the documents again. Kane, he said, without particular tone. He's claiming his company's upstream usage predates these rights, Ethan said. It doesn't. Jessup said it flatly, with the certainty of someone who was stating arithmetic. I was working when your father secured these rights. I processed the registration myself. He looked at Ethan directly. Your father came into that office in the spring of 1879 with Thomas Alderman's survey and 2 witnesses, and we registered that water claim before noon on a Tuesday, and I went home that evening and told my wife we'd done a good day's work. He picked up the folder and closed it and held it for a moment. Kane incorporated his company in 1893. He knows these rights predate him. He's been hoping nobody could find the proof. Claire looked at Ethan. I was looking at Jessup with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something that was close to relief but carried the particular weight that relief has when it comes after a long time of not having it. Will you testify? She asked Jessup again. He handed the folder back to her. I'm 81 years old, he said. I don't have many chances left to tell the truth in a room where it matters. He looked between them. When do you need me? The ride back from Jessup's house was quiet for the first few miles. The road ran west and the sun was in the low part of the afternoon sky, flat and cold and giving no warmth, and the horses moved steadily and didn't require direction. Claire rode with the folder in her saddlebag and her hands loose on the reins, and her mind doing what it did when a problem began to take a shape she could work with, organizing itself, sorting, identifying what remained to be done. He'll fight it, she said after a while. Ethan glanced at her. Kane. Even with Jessup's testimony and the documents, he'll fight it. He has lawyers who are paid to find problems with evidence, and he has money to pay them for a long time. She looked at the road ahead. We need to be in a better position before this reaches a courtroom. We need to have answered every question they're going to ask before they can ask it. What does that mean practically? It means we need to find the original water registration record. Jessup remembers processing it. That means it exists somewhere. County records from 1879 don't disappear, they just move. She'd thought about this on the ride over. The Territorial Archives in Helena would have a copy. The county recorder's office in Billings might have the original registration log from that year. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's a long ride to Billings. I know, but a record we can hold in our hands is worth more than a man's memory, even a reliable man's memory. He nodded slowly. You're right. I usually am, she said, and then immediately felt the boldness of it and waited for the discomfort. Instead, he laughed. Not the controlled near laugh she'd heard a few times, an actual laugh, short and genuine, that changed his face entirely. She hadn't heard him laugh before. She filed it away in the same careful place she filed other things she wasn't examining directly. I'll arrange for someone to go to Billings, he said. I'd like to go myself. He looked at her. It's a 3-day ride. I know. It's also cold. I've been cold before. He looked at her for a moment longer, and she looked back without flinching, and then he returned his eyes to the road. I'll go with you, he said. She'd expected an argument. The absence of one was something she didn't quite know what to do with, so she simply nodded and said, We should leave by Thursday, to be back before Kane's 30 days run out. Thursday, he agreed. They rode the rest of the way back in a silence that was different from the silence they'd started with. Fuller, somehow. Carrying more. The 2 days before the Billings ride were not simple. They were not the kind of days where everything proceeds according to plan, which Claire had learned was most days, and she managed them accordingly. The first complication came on Wednesday morning when 2 of the ranch hands got into a disagreement with Gus over the water situation in the northern channels. The flow had dropped another measurable amount overnight, and 3 men had gone out at dawn to investigate and come back with different accounts of what they'd seen. One said there was evidence of upstream diversion, one said it was natural settling, and Gus said both of them were wrong, and the problem was a blockage a mile north of the main intake. None of them could agree, and none of them was entirely reliable as an observer when he was also a party to the dispute. Claire heard about this at the 6 o'clock meal when the volume at the table told her something was off. She asked a few questions. She listened to the various accounts. Then she said, with the quiet that she'd found was more effective than volume, that she was going to ride out to the northern intake herself that afternoon and look at it. 3 men looked at her as though she'd said something confusing. You don't need to do that, one of them said. His name was Darren, and he'd been on the ranch since before Ethan had taken over from his father, and he had the particular confidence of someone accustomed to women not going to look at water intakes. I do, actually, she said pleasantly, and went back to the kitchen. She rode out after the noon meal. She found the intake without difficulty, because she'd been paying attention when Ethan described the water system, which was something she'd done with most of the things Ethan had described. Not because she'd anticipated needing the information, but because she paid attention as a matter of practice. Gus was right. There was a blockage, debris, probably from a tree that had come down upstream sometime in the past 2 weeks, compacted against the intake screen. It wasn't deliberate. It was simply what happened when nobody was paying attention. She had the tools she'd brought because she'd thought ahead, and she cleared the worst of it herself and marked the rest for a crew to finish. She was cold by the time she was done, and her boots were wet to the ankle for the second time this week, and her back was making itself known in a way she was going to have to address soon. When she got back to the ranch and handed her horse to Pete and walked toward the house, she passed Darren coming out of the barn. He stopped. He looked at her. Her wet boots and the tools in her hand told the story well enough. Gus was right, she said. Debris blockage at the intake. I cleared what I could. You'll want to send a crew tomorrow to finish. Darren was quiet for a moment. Then, you didn't have to do that yourself. No, she said, but nobody else was going to settle the argument, and we leave for Billings Thursday. He looked at her with an expression that was doing something she recognized. It was the expression of a person who had categorized you one way and was now realizing the category was wrong and was working out what to put in its place. It wasn't hostility. It was something more complicated than that, the kind of reconsideration that went slower because it went deeper. You're going to Billings with the boss? He asked. On ranch business, she said, and walked inside. The second complication came on Wednesday evening in the form of a letter delivered to the ranch by a rider she didn't recognize, a young man who came to the front door rather than the back, which was unusual, and who left before she'd thought to ask who had sent him. The letter was addressed to Ethan. She left it on his desk and didn't open it, but something about the way it had arrived, the formal front door delivery, the stranger who didn't stay, settled in the back of her mind as a data point she couldn't yet connect to anything. Ethan read it at his desk. She was in the office making a final check on the copies when she heard him push his chair back. He came to the office door. He had the letter in his hand. His face was the careful version again. Kane's lawyers have been talking to the workers, he said. She set down her pen. Which workers? At least 3. They've been approached in town separately, asked about the water situation, the ranch's financial position, whether there have been recent changes to how the operation is being run. He paused. Whether there's been any new person at the ranch making decisions. The last sentence landed in a particular way. She let it. They're trying to build a picture, she said. Yes. What kind of picture? He looked at the letter, then at her. One where I'm being poorly advised, where recent decisions have been made without proper authority. He set the letter on the desk between them. One where you've overstepped your position here in a way that could be used to challenge anything we bring into a courtroom. She read the letter. It was thorough, and she recognized the shape of the argument being built. The way you could see the skeleton of a building in early framing before the walls went up. Kane's people were going to try to argue that any documentation she'd found or handled or copied had been tampered with, that any processes she'd been involved in were irregular, that her presence and her influence on Ethan's decisions gave them grounds to challenge everything. It was smart. She didn't want to respect it, and she did anyway, because that was the only way to deal with it. They'll need witnesses, she said. To support that argument, they'd need someone from the ranch to say I'd overstepped. Someone willing to say it under oath. She and Ethan looked at each other. Darren, she said quietly. I don't know, he said, but he didn't sound certain. He doesn't like me, she said it without heat. That's not a criticism of him. It's a fact. He's been here longer than anyone, and I arrived and made changes and didn't ask permission. He has reason not to like me. She thought for a moment. Is he loyal to you? He's always been. Then we should talk to him, before Kane's people talk to him again. She met Ethan's eyes. Not to pressure him, just to be honest with him about what's happening and what's at stake. He deserves to know. Ethan nodded slowly. I'll talk to him tonight. I'll come with you. He looked at her, surprised. If they're going to try to use me as a problem, she said, then the best thing I can do is stop being one. Let Darren see me in the room, having a conversation, not hiding from it. Ethan considered this. That takes nerve, he said. I have plenty of nerve, she said. It's other things I'm shorter on. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. They talked to Darren after supper, in the barn, where Darren was comfortable and the conversation could be private without being secret. Ethan explained the situation plainly. Kane's lawyers, the water rights documents, what was being challenged, and what was at stake. He didn't ask Darren for anything. He just told him the truth and let it sit. Darren listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on Ethan, and only looked at Claire once, briefly, near the end. He didn't say much. He asked a few questions about the water rights documents, specific questions, the kind that came from someone who'd worked this land for decades and knew what water meant to a cattle operation. Ethan answered them. At the end, Darren said, "Your father was a fair man." "He was," Ethan said, "and you're telling me all of this before anyone asked you to." Yes. Darren looked at the ground for a moment. Then at Claire, directly, for the first time. You found those documents, he said. I did, she said. And you cleared the intake yesterday. Most of it. He was quiet. He looked like a man rearranging furniture in his mind, trying to figure out where things fit now that the room had changed shape. Kane's man came to me Monday, he said, in town. Bought me a drink and asked me questions about how the place was being managed. He looked at Ethan. I didn't tell him anything that wasn't already public. I know, Ethan said. He'll come back. Probably. And if he does? Ethan looked at him steadily. That's your choice to make. I'm not going to tell you what to say to anyone. Darren made a sound deep in his throat, the kind of sound that was doing the work a whole sentence would take up more space than he had available. He reached for the lantern on the post and moved it a few inches for no apparent reason and then moved it back. I'm not going to help Kane take this ranch, he said finally. My father worked here before me, and I'll work here until I can't stand up, and I won't help someone take it. He glanced at Claire again, briefer this time. She did right by the intake. I'll say that to anyone who asks. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a speech. But Claire understood that it was exactly what it was. A man deciding which way to stand, without drama and without being asked to perform the decision for anyone's benefit. She walked back to the house through the cold dark, and she thought about all the different kinds of loyalty there were in the world, and how the most durable ones always looked like this, not announced, just present, showing up in the small definitive moments where it mattered. Thursday came cold and clear. She packed a bag with what she needed and not more than that, which had become a particular skill of hers, and she went to the kitchen and made sure everything was organized for the days she'd be away and left clear instructions for Pete, who was responsible enough to be trusted with them. When she came out to the front, the horses were ready. Ethan was checking the saddlebags with the deliberate attention he gave to anything practical, making sure the weight was balanced, that nothing would shift on the long road. The morning air was thin and cold and tasted of distance, the particular flavor of a day that was going to go a long way from where it started. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up and settled into the saddle, and for a moment she just sat there while the horse found its feet on the frozen ground, and she looked at the ranch house with its covered porch and its 3 stories of dressed timber and river stone, and she thought about what it meant to fight for a place. Not own it, fight for it. Understand it well enough to defend it, know its history well enough to hold it up against someone who wanted to take it. You ready? Ethan said beside her. She turned her eyes toward the road. I've been ready, she said. They rode out through the gate as the sun cleared the ridge to the east, and the frozen ground rang under the horses' feet like something solid and decided, and behind them the ranch settled into its morning the way it did every morning, with the sounds of work beginning and smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney and the world doing what it did when the people who held it steady were briefly, necessarily, away. The road to Billings took 2.5 days in weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to do. The first morning was cold and clear, the kind of cold that was honest about itself, that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. By the second afternoon, a wind had come in from the northwest, and it carried moisture that hadn't yet decided whether to be rain or snow, and it found every gap in a coat and a scarf, and settled in there and stayed. Claire didn't complain about it. Ethan didn't either, which she appreciated. They rode at a pace that covered ground without punishing the horses, and they stopped twice a day to water and rest the animals, and they ate from what they'd packed and didn't talk more than the situation required. It was a particular kind of companionship, the kind that didn't need to fill itself with words, that was comfortable enough in silence that silence wasn't a problem to be solved. She noticed things about him on the road that she hadn't been able to notice at the ranch, where there was always something else to look at. The way he read terrain without appearing to, his eyes moving across a rise or a draw with the automatic attention of someone who'd been reading landscape since before he could read words. The way he handled his horse, which was not showy but was consistently correct, small adjustments made before they became necessary. He was careful with things that depended on him. She'd seen that at the ranch, and she saw it here, in a different context, which confirmed it as a quality rather than a performance. They made camp the first night at a creek crossing that had a shelf of rock on the south-facing bank, which blocked the wind from one direction. He built a fire without ceremony, and she made coffee from what she'd packed, and they sat beside the fire and ate and didn't say much. And at some point she realized the silence between them had become a comfortable thing, which was either progress or trouble, and she wasn't ready to determine which. "Tell me about Ohio," he said, after a while. She looked at the fire. "What about it?" "Whatever you want to say." She thought about that. About what she wanted to say versus what she would usually say, which were often different things. "It was a small city," she said. "Not a town, but not large. My husband's family had been there 2 generations. The business had been there that long too." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "It wasn't a bad life. It just wasn't mine in the end. I'd been keeping the books and managing the correspondence and smoothing over the problems with suppliers since the first year of our marriage, but nobody called it what it was." "What was it?" "Running a business." She looked up from the fire. "When James died, the creditors came and they talked to his brother and they talked to the bank and they talked to the lawyer and nobody talked to me. Even though I was the one who knew where everything was. Even though I was the one who could have told them exactly how to restructure the debt." She stopped. "They weren't cruel about it. That's what I've always thought was most interesting. They weren't hostile. They just didn't see me as someone who was in the conversation." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What did you do?" "I stayed for 4 months and tried to make myself part of the conversation, and then I realized I was spending energy I didn't have on people who weren't going to change their minds, and I left." She looked at the fire again. "I went to St. Louis first, then north. I worked where I could find work. It took longer than it should have to find something worth staying for." He didn't say anything. She'd noticed that he didn't rush to fill the spaces after she said something real. He let it be what it was, which was rarer than people thought. "What about you?" she said. It wasn't really a question, the way she said it. More an offering of space, if he wanted it. He did, after a moment. "My father died 8 years ago," he said. "My mother had been gone since I was 12. After my father, I was already running the ranch, had been for 3 years while he was sick, but it changed when he was gone. The way things feel when they're yours." He looked at the fire. "There was a woman, before. We were going to be married." He stopped there. She waited. "She chose differently," he said simply. "I can't blame her for it. The ranch was everything I could offer, and it wasn't enough, and I understood that." He picked up a stick and turned it in his hand. "After that, I stopped. I stopped looking for something outside the work. The work was enough. It was manageable." She understood what he meant by manageable. She'd been managing herself for 2 years. It was sustainable in the way that anything was sustainable if you didn't examine it too closely. They let the fire do what fires do in the silence after honest conversation. And eventually they banked it, and she wrapped in her blanket and looked at the sky, which had cleared enough to show stars, and slept better than she expected to. The county recorder's office in Billings occupied the ground floor of a building that smelled of paper and old wood, and the particular institutional mustiness of a place where documents went to be preserved and mostly forgotten. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with ink-stained fingers who looked at them with the mild suspicion that people who worked with records developed toward anyone who came looking for old ones. Claire set her copies on the desk and explained what she needed without embellishment. The original registration log from 1879, specifically the water rights entries from spring of that year, Blackwood Creek, registered by a man named Elias Blackwood, with survey documentation from County Surveyor Thomas Alderman. The clerk looked at the copies, then at Ethan, then at Claire, then back at the copies. 1879, he said. That's correct. Those records would be in the archive room. I'd need to find the right log volume. He said this in the tone of someone explaining that a thing was possible but would require effort he hadn't planned for this morning. We'll wait, Claire said. He went. He was gone 40 minutes. She used the time to review the copies she'd brought and compare them against the notes she'd been keeping in a small leather notebook she carried in her coat pocket, a habit she'd developed in Ohio and never stopped. Ethan stood at the window and watched the street with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting on things that mattered. When the clerk came back, he was carrying a large bound ledger with a cloth cover that had once been red and was now a brownish pink, and his expression had changed slightly from mild suspicion to something more engaged. I found it, he said, and he said it the way people say things when they've surprised themselves. He put the ledger on the desk and opened it to a page he'd marked with a slip of paper. Blackwood Creek Water Rights, April 14, 1879. Registered to Elias Blackwood. rancher, but with survey documentation from Thomas Alderman, county surveyor. He looked up. It's all here. Claire looked at the page. The entry was clear and complete, written in the formal copperplate of a 19th century county office, with the registration number and the date and Alderman's survey reference number beside it. She looked at the survey reference number and then looked at the surveyor's letter from the folder, and the numbers matched exactly, which meant the chain of documentation was complete and unbroken. She felt something that she would have called relief if that word were sufficient. It wasn't, quite. It was the particular feeling of having looked for something you needed and found it where you'd hoped it would be, compounded by the knowledge of what it meant and what it would prevent. I need a certified copy of this entry, she said to the clerk. He looked at the ledger. That takes a day to process. We'll be here tomorrow morning. He nodded, and she could see him recalibrating his morning accordingly. Ethan was standing very still beside her. She glanced at him. His jaw was set and his eyes were on the page, and there was something in his face that was older than his years. The look of a man seeing something his father had built 30 years ago, something that had survived his father's death and the passage of 3 decades and Kane's lawyers and the careful neglect of an East room that nobody had opened in 5 years. Your father was thorough, she said quietly. He didn't speak for a moment. He was, he said finally. He was the most thorough man I ever knew. They had one night in Billings before the certified copy would be ready, and they spent it at a hotel on the main street that was clean, if not comfortable, and they ate supper in the dining room below, which was more formally arranged than either of them had been prepared for. There were tablecloths and a waiter who introduced himself, and Claire was still in her riding clothes and Ethan's coat had mud at the hem, and they both looked slightly wrong for the room, which they acknowledged to each other with a shared look that did the work a whole conversation would have taken. The food was good. She hadn't expected it to be. She'd expected acceptable and gotten better than that, which was a small surplus she accepted gratefully. They talked about what came next, the logistics of the courtroom, the order in which evidence should be presented, the question of which lawyer Ethan should retain, and whether he knew anyone in Helena who had experience with water rights specifically. She asked about this because she'd been thinking about it since Jessup's house, and she'd formed a view about what kind of legal mind this situation required. Not someone aggressive, she said. That's the instinct, but it's wrong. Kane wants to make this look like a fight, and if we come in swinging, that's the story. We want someone methodical, someone who presents evidence the way you'd explain something to a reasonable person, quietly, one piece after another, until there's no room left for doubt. Ethan listened with his hands around his water glass. You've thought about this. I think about things on horseback, she said. There's not much else to do. He almost smiled again. It was still almost, but the almost was getting closer to something. I know a man in Helena, he said. Robert Caulfield. He's not dramatic. He's the kind of lawyer who makes everyone in the room feel slightly bored right up until they realize they've agreed with him on every point. He paused. I should have called him in when Kane first started making noise. I kept thinking I could handle it without it becoming a legal matter. You couldn't have known. I could have been less stubborn about it. She looked at him across the table. Stubbornness isn't always wrong, she said. You held out long enough for the documents to matter. If you'd settled earlier, we'd never have found them. He looked at her for a moment. In the dining room's warmer light, he looked different than he did at the ranch. Not softer exactly, but more visible somehow, as though the particular quality of the light was revealing something the ranch's working light kept in shadow. You defend me more than I deserve, he said. I defend positions I think are accurate, she said. It's not about you specifically. He held her gaze. Isn't it? She picked up her water glass and looked away, which was the most honest thing she could do, and he let her do it, which was the second most honest response available. The certified copy was ready at 9 the following morning. The clerk handed it over with a kind of reverence that documents sometimes inspired in people who spent their professional lives around them, a recognition that certain pieces of paper carried more weight than their physical substance suggested. Claire signed the receipt and put the certified copy in the folder with everything else, and held the folder under her arm and walked out into the cold morning air. Ethan was waiting with the horses. He looked at her face when she came out and read what was in it before she said anything. We have it, she said. He nodded once. He didn't celebrate it. There was nothing to celebrate yet. They both understood that. What they had was ammunition. The fight was still ahead. They rode back faster than they'd come, not punishing the horses, but not conserving time the way they had on the way out. The weather had settled into a clear, biting cold that made the road firm under hoof, and the air sharp enough that breathing it felt like doing something. Claire rode with the folder in her saddlebag and her mind in the courtroom, anticipating the arguments Kane's lawyers would make and working out responses to each one, which was the only productive use she could think of for 3 hours in a saddle with a problem that was mostly solved and not yet finished. She was working through the question of the upstream diversion, whether Kane's people had physically interfered with the water flow and how to document it if they had, when Ethan said from beside her, "What are you thinking about?" "The water channels," she said, "the drop in flow we saw before we left. If Kane's people diverted water deliberately, that's not a civil matter. That's criminal interference. But we'd need to document it before it gets repaired." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I had Gus keep a log of the flow rate starting the week we noticed the drop. Daily measurements, documented." She looked at him. "That was my next thing to suggest." "I thought it might be," he said, "so I did it before you could." She turned back to the road. Something in her chest did a small thing that she ignored with the discipline she'd developed for ignoring small things her chest did. "Smart," she said. "I have my moments," he said. They arrived back at Blackwood Ranch on the evening of the third day, after dark, when the bunkhouse lights were already on, and the smell of supper had been replaced by the smell of wood smoke and cold, and the particular end-of-day scent of a working ranch settling into its night. The horses were tired. She was tired. She could feel it in her back and her hands, and a specific place behind her eyes that meant she'd been looking at distance too long. Pete came to take the horses, and Gus was crossing from the barn and stopped when he saw them, and gave a nod that meant he was glad they were back and didn't need to make an event of saying so. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Someone, she suspected Pete, had left the stove banked and a pot of something on the back of it, which was either initiative or instruction she'd left and forgotten leaving. But either way, it was there and she was grateful for it. She put the folder on the kitchen table and took off her coat and hung it, and stood at the stove for a moment with her hands near the warmth. Her back hurt. Her hands were stiff. She was home, she thought, and then caught herself thinking it and held it at arm's length for a moment, examined it, and put it carefully back. Ethan came in behind her and put the saddlebags down and looked at the folder on the table and then at her. "Eat something," he said, "then sleep. I need to go through the folder first, make sure everything survived the ride. It'll survive another few hours. I'd rather, Claire." He said it with a particular weight, not commanding, not asking, something between the two that she didn't have a word for. "Eat something, sleep. The folder will be here in the morning." She looked at him. I was tired too. She could see it now that they were inside in the lamplight, the way the travel had worked on him, the 3 days of cold and distance, and the particular weight of what they'd found in Billings and what it meant. But he was looking at her with a steadiness that didn't waver. She pulled a chair out and sat down. "Fine," she said. He heated the soup himself, which she noticed. He didn't ask if she wanted help. He didn't suggest she handle it since the kitchen was her domain. He just did it, which was the kind of thing that was easy to overlook and harder to stop thinking about once you'd noticed it. They ate without talking much. It was a different quiet than the quiet of the road, denser, warmer, carrying more in it. She ate until she was finished, and then she sat with her hands around an empty bowl and felt the specific tiredness of a person who has been moving towards something for 3 days and has arrived at it and can stop moving temporarily. "Victor Kane is going to be in that courtroom," she said quietly. "Yes." "I've never seen him, only heard about him." Ethan put down his spoon. "He's a big man. Not fat, just large. The kind of man who takes up space and knows it and uses it." He thought for a moment. "He's not stupid. That's what people get wrong about him. They think because he's aggressive that he's not thinking. He thinks. He just thinks that what he wants is more important than what anyone else has. He'll try to undermine the documents. He'll try to undermine everything, including me." Ethan looked at her. "Yes," he said, "including you. I want you to be prepared for that." "I am." She looked at the folder on the table. "I've been underestimated my entire adult life. It stopped being a surprise a long time ago." She glanced at him. "What it does is make people careless. They underestimate you, and then they stop watching, and that's when you can do the most work. He was looking at her with the expression she'd stopped trying not to look at, because looking away from it required more effort than she had left tonight. 3 days of writing still in her joints, and the folder on the table between them, and the lamp throwing its circle of light out against the kitchen dark. "Go to sleep," he said gently. "We'll start in the morning." She went. She was asleep before she'd expected to be. 3 days later, Victor Kane came to the ranch himself. She hadn't expected this. She should have, she thought afterward. She should have anticipated that a man like Kane wouldn't wait for a courtroom when he could apply pressure directly. But she'd been focused on the preparation, on organizing the documents, and corresponding with Robert Caulfield and Helena, and working through the timeline of evidence with Ethan in the evenings. And she'd been caught slightly off guard when Gus came to the kitchen door in the early afternoon and said, with the particular flatness of someone delivering unwelcome information, "There's a man at the gate. Big man. Says his name is Kane." She looked at Ethan, who was at the table with the survey maps. He looked at her. "I'll go," he said. "I'm coming with you." "Claire, I'm coming with you," she said again, and she untied her apron and hung it on the hook and went to the door. Kane was at the front gate, not inside it, standing at the boundary of the property, the way people stand at boundaries when they're making a point about them. He was exactly as Ethan had described, large, not in any way that was soft, with a face that had settled into the expression of a man who had spent decades getting what he wanted and had arranged his features accordingly. He had 2 men with him who stood slightly behind and to the sides, positioned in the particular way that said their role was not clerical. He looked at Ethan when they came out, and then at Claire, and what he did with his expression when he saw her was something she recognized, the slight dismissal that was so automatic it wasn't even conscious. She filed this away. "Blackwood," he said. I didn't say her name because he didn't acknowledge her presence as something requiring acknowledgement. "Kane," Ethan said. He stopped 10 feet from the gate and didn't approach it, which Claire understood as the correct choice. This was his property, and he was standing on it, and Kane was not. "I heard you took a trip to Billings," Kane said. His voice was what she'd expected, large in the same way he was, filling the space it had available. "I travel sometimes," Ethan said. "The county recorder's office." Kane tilted his head slightly. "Looking through old records." "I look at all kinds of things." Kane's eyes moved to Claire again. This time they stayed longer. "This the woman who's been going through your father's papers?" "This is Miss Whitmore," Ethan said. "She manages the ranch house." "Does she?" The way he said it wasn't a question. Claire looked at him steadily and said nothing, because she'd learned that silence in the right moment had more weight than any response. "I'll be straightforward with you, Blackwood," Kane said, returning his eyes to Ethan. "Whatever you think you found in those old files, my lawyers have already reviewed the question of these water rights thoroughly. Any documentation from 1879 is going to be challenged on the grounds of authentication. Paper degrades. Ink shifts. Signatures are disputed." He paused. "This is going to be expensive and long and hard on your operation. Your cattle numbers are going to be questioned. Your workers are going to be interviewed under oath. Everything your housekeeper has been involved with is going to be scrutinized." He said housekeeper the way you use a word when you want it to be slightly smaller than it is. "I appreciate your concern for my operation," Ethan said. His voice was level. She'd heard it at this level before. It was the voice he used when he was more certain than he looked. "This isn't concern," Kane said. "This is courtesy. Take the offer. The water rights aren't worth what this fight is going to cost you." "I disagree." Kane looked at him for a long moment. Then, almost as an afterthought, he looked at Claire again. "You seem like an intelligent woman," he said. "You understand how these things go. A ranch this size, with the legal costs ahead, the cash flow problems, you'd be looking at a difficult next 2 years even if you win, which you won't." He paused. Intelligent people know when to advise their employer toward the practical choice. She looked at him with the same level attention she'd been giving him. "I advise Mr. Blackwood based on the evidence available," she said. "The evidence I've found suggests his position is strong." She let a moment pass. "But thank you for your assessment." Kane's expression did something small and not particularly pleasant. He looked at Ethan. 30 days is almost up." "I'm aware of the calendar," Ethan said. Kane nodded once, turned, and walked back to his horse with his 2 men following, and they rode out the way they'd come, and the gate creaked in the wind behind them. She and Ethan stood at the front of the house until the riders were gone past the first rise. "He's rattled," she said. Ethan looked at her. "How can you tell?" "He came here himself. A man who is confident in his lawyers doesn't make house calls. He comes when he thinks a personal presence will do something the lawyers can't." She watched the empty road. "He's heard about the Billings trip, and he doesn't know what we found, and it's bothering him. Or he's warning us because he thinks he's already won, and he wants it over." "Maybe," she said, "but he looked at you when he mentioned the water rights being challenged. He looked at me when he talked about the cost." She turned back toward the house. "He's trying to find the crack, the place where one of us breaks away from the other." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "We don't give him one." Ethan was quiet beside her. "He was rude to you." "He was strategic," she said. "It's different. Rude is incidental. What he did was deliberate." She reached the porch steps and stopped, and turned to look at him because she needed him to understand this next part. "He's going to use me in the courtroom. My involvement in finding the documents, my role at the ranch. He's going to argue I had a motive to fabricate or influence the evidence. The story he wants to tell is that I arrived here from nowhere, with no verifiable history in Montana, and inserted myself into your business decisions." She held his gaze. "We need to be ahead of that argument. We need to document everything I've done and how I did it and who saw it. Every supply order, every decision, every conversation with a witness present." "You've already thought all of this through," he said. "I've been thinking about it since that letter came Wednesday." He looked at her for a long moment on the porch steps, with the cold coming off the high ground and the afternoon light going sideways across the ranch yard. She could see him thinking, really thinking, in the still way he had, letting the full weight of something settle before he responded to it. "What did you think?" he said finally, "when Kane talked to you directly? What did you actually think, not what you were calculating?" The question surprised her. She looked at him, then at the yard, then back. "I thought he was afraid of me," she said, "which means I'm doing something right." Something moved in Ethan's face, not the expression she usually avoided, something newer than that, something that had only been there since Billings, since the fire at the creek crossing and the dining room with the tablecloths and 3 days of riding in the same direction together. "You are," he said, "doing something right." He went inside. She stood on the porch for another moment and breathed the cold air and let her hands go still at her sides. The certified copy was in the folder on the kitchen table. Jessup had agreed to testify. Caulfield and Helena had reviewed the documentation and sent back a letter that used words like compelling and well-established. The flow logs Gus had kept showed a consistent and statistically implausible drop in water flow over a period of 3 weeks that did not correspond with any seasonal pattern. They had built something real. She could feel the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of anything you've constructed with your own hands. Not perfectly, not without worry, but solidly enough to stand on. But Kane wasn't done. She knew that the way she knew most things about difficult people, which was from experience with the pattern. A man who drove out to someone's gate to deliver a personal warning was a man who had something else to try. Whatever it was coming. She went inside and rebuilt the kitchen fire and started on the evening meal and thought about documentation and testimony and the particular gap in their case that was still bothering her. The question of who else had been present when the original water rights were registered, whether there were witnesses beyond the county record, whether any of them were still alive and findable. The county record and Jessup's testimony and the survey documentation were strong, but a chain of evidence was only as strong as the space between its links, and she was still thinking about a space that wasn't filled yet. She didn't know what was in that space. She only knew it was there. She cut the vegetables for the stew and let the fire do its work and kept thinking, because that was what she did with problems that weren't finished, and this one wasn't finished yet, not by a long distance. The 30 days on Kane's letter were running. The courtroom was ahead. And somewhere in the territory, a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted was doing what Claire was doing right now. Sitting with a problem, thinking about where the gap was, and working out what to put in it. The difference was that she was right and he was not. She had to trust that the difference mattered. She had spent enough of her life watching people with power, and no truth defeat people with truth, and no power to know that it wasn't guaranteed. But she had to trust it anyway, because the alternative was to stop, and she was not built for stopping. The fire caught, and the stew began to heat, and the evening came down over Blackwood Ranch, and somewhere in the frozen ground beneath it, water moved through channels that had belonged to this land for 30 years, and no piece of paper and no man at a gate had changed that yet. The gap that had been bothering her revealed itself on a Tuesday. She'd been working at it the way you work at something you can feel but not yet see. Not directly, not with a fixed stare, but sideways, letting her mind move around the edges of it while her hands did other things. She was reorganizing the supply ledger, 3 weeks of entries that needed to be brought current, when she looked up at the kitchen window and stopped moving entirely. The witnesses. The county record showed the registration. Jessup remembered processing it. The survey documentation was signed and sealed by aldermen. But the original registration entry, she'd looked at it in Billings, had the certified copy in the folder, had 2 witness lines at the bottom. Both signed. Neither name she'd recognized at the time because she'd been focused on the registration itself, on Alderman's survey number and the date and Elias Blackwood's signature. She went to the folder and pulled the certified copy and looked at the witness lines. 2 names in the formal copperplate of the county office, written by the clerk, not by the witnesses themselves. Walter Price. Thomas Dungan. She didn't know those names. That didn't mean they were dead. That didn't mean they'd left the territory. It meant she hadn't looked yet, which was a different thing entirely. She left the ledger where it was and went to find Ethan. I was in the barn working on a section of harness that had cracked in the cold, and he looked up when she came in with the copy in her hand and her coat not fully buttoned because she'd come out without thinking about the temperature. "The witness lines," she said, and put the copy in front of him. "These 2 men, Walter Price and Thomas Dunnigan. Do you know those names?" He took the copy and looked at it. He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was actually searching his memory, not performing the act of it. "Price," he said slowly. "There was a Price family, cattle operation smaller than ours. They sold and moved to Oregon, I think, maybe 15 years ago." He kept looking at the paper. "Dunnigan." He stopped again. A longer pause this time. "Thomas Dunnigan. My father mentioned a Dunnigan once. A lawyer or a land agent, someone he'd done business with in the early days. Was he from this county?" "I don't know. It was in passing. I was young." He handed the copy back to her, and she could see him working. Harlan Jessup would know. He was in the county office in 1879. He processed the registration. He'd remember who was present. "Jessup is the one person we know Kane's people haven't been able to get to," she said. "He doesn't leave his house. He doesn't take visitors. He doesn't know. Which means he might know something they haven't had the chance to find out he knows." She folded the copy carefully. "I need to go back to him." "We both go," Ethan said. He set the harness down without hesitation. "Tomorrow morning." Jessup answered the door in the same cardigan with the same repaired patches and different colored thread, and he looked at them with the same clear-eyed assessment, and she thought there was something reassuring about a person who was consistently themselves, regardless of circumstance. "Twice in 2 weeks," he said. "Sit down." They sat in the study among the well-organized ledgers and correspondence, and she put the certified copy on his desk and pointed to the witness lines and asked him directly what he remembered about Walter Price and Thomas Dunnigan. Jessup looked at the names for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair in the particular way of someone settling into something they remember well. "Walter Price was a cattleman," he said. "Had a spread about 12 miles south of Blackwood. Decent operation. He was a friend of Elias. Not close, but the kind of friend you have in this territory, which is practical and reliable." He paused. "He sold and left for Oregon. That would have been around 1890, maybe 1891. I don't know if he's living." "And Dunnigan?" Jessup was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of searching, the quiet of considering how to say something. "Thomas Dunnigan was a land agent," he said. "He worked out of Helena primarily, but he came through this county regularly in the 70s and 80s because there was significant land activity. Good man, careful." He looked at the copy again. "Your father knew him through land business. When he secured the water rights, he asked Dunnigan to witness the registration because Dunnigan was in Billings that week, and Elias trusted him to remember it accurately if it was ever needed." Claire felt something settle in the specific way that a piece you've been looking for settles when it finds its place. "Is he living?" Jessup took off his glasses and cleaned them. She'd come to understand this as his version of pausing for effect. Not performative, just the physical habit of someone who needed a moment before a significant sentence. Thomas Dunnigan retired to a small property outside Helena, he said. His daughter corresponded with my wife for some years. As of last spring, he was still there. He put his glasses back on. He would be 76. He had his mind when I last heard of him, which was 8 months ago. He looked at Claire over the tops of his glasses. You want to know if he'd testify? I want to know if he's alive and able, she said. The willingness is his to decide. Jessup looked at the copy one more time. Then he looked at Ethan. Your father was a good man, he said. He didn't deserve what Kane's been trying to do to his legacy. He straightened in his chair. I'll write to Dunnigan today. He'll listen to a letter from me better than a letter from a stranger. We're running short on time, Ethan said. The injunction filing date is… I know what an injunction is, Jessup said without heat. I'll write today. You'll have an answer in a week if the Post cooperates. He looked at Claire. In the meantime, I'd suggest you stop worrying about what you don't yet have and make sure what you do have is unassailable. I'm doing both simultaneously, she said. He looked at her for a moment and made the sound that she'd come to understand meant he was satisfied with an answer. Good, he said. Robert Caulfield arrived from Helena on a Thursday with a leather case that looked older than he did and a manner that was exactly what Ethan had described. Methodical, undramatic, and possessed of a stillness that made you want to pay attention because he never wasted anything he said. He was in his early 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had learned to give nothing away in rooms where giving things away cost money. He spent the first 2 hours at the kitchen table going through every document in the folder, in order, without comment. Claire sat across from him with her notebook and Ethan sat at the end of the table, and Caulfield read with the focused quiet of someone doing the kind of work that looked simple from the outside and wasn't. When he finished, he closed the folder and put his hands flat on it. It's a strong position, he said, stronger than I expected when Ethan described it to me. He looked at Claire. You reconstructed the chain of documentation from what was in the East Room? I found it. The chain was already there. It just needed someone to look. You have copies in a separate location from the originals? The originals are in a locked box in the ranch office. I have copies at 3 locations, here, with you, and at the county recorder's in Billings. Something moved in Caulfield's expression that was the lawyer's version of approval, which was to say it was subtle, but it was there. Kane's legal team will argue chain of custody, he said. They'll argue that the documents were found and handled by an individual with… They'll try to establish a motive for alteration. I know, Claire said. They've already been building that argument. I've documented every step of what I found and how and when, with witnesses where possible. Who were your witnesses to the initial discovery? Ethan was present when I found the primary folder in the East Room. He can testify to the condition of the room and the position of the documents. Gus, the head hand, can testify to my access to the storage room where I found the secondary financial records. Separate matter, but it establishes that I operate transparently. Caulfield nodded. Jessup. He's confirmed and willing. He's also written to a second witness to the original 1879 registration, Thomas Dunnigan, currently in Helena. We're waiting on a response. Caulfield looked at Ethan. If Dunnigan is available and willing, this case becomes substantially more difficult for Kane to attack. 2 living witnesses to the original registration, plus the county record, plus Alderman's sealed survey documentation. That's not a case you defeat with authentication arguments. That's a case you can only defeat by making the court distrust the people presenting the evidence. Which is what he's going to try to do, Ethan said. Yes. Caulfield looked at Claire again. Which means you need to be prepared for what that looks like in a courtroom. Kane's lawyers are going to put your background, your employment history, your reasons for being at this ranch, under examination. They're going to try to make this about you rather than about the documents. I understand. Do you have documentation of your employment history prior to Blackwood Ranch? References, correspondence, anything that establishes who you are independent of your position here? She had some. Not as much as she'd like. Ohio felt very far away and very long ago, and the people there who could vouch for her were people she hadn't been in contact with since she'd left, which was the nature of leaving. Some, she said. I can write to 2 people in Ohio who knew me and James, his lawyer, and the woman who managed the business accounts with me. They're honest people. Write immediately, Caulfield said. We need responses before the hearing date. He looked between them. The hearing is in 18 days. That's tight but workable, provided Dunnigan comes through. He picked up his pen. Let's go through the timeline from the beginning. I need every fact in the order it occurred, every name, every date, every place. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, Caulfield asking and Claire and Ethan answering, and she noticed that Caulfield asked her questions and Ethan's questions with equal weight, which was not something she'd expected and appreciated more than she showed. At one point, around 7 in the evening when the lamp was doing most of the work, Caulfield asked her to describe in order the steps she'd taken from arriving at the ranch to finding the primary folder. She described them, concisely and in sequence. He took notes without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. "You have a very clear memory for sequence," he said. "I kept a notebook," she said. "I keep a notebook for most things." "May I see it?" She handed it to him. He went through it page by page with the same focused quiet he'd given the documents, and she watched him do it and felt the mild vulnerability of having someone read the working record of your mind, the way you'd feel showing someone a room you lived in that you hadn't planned to show. "This is going to be important," he said. "This contemporaneous record, kept in your hand, dated, this is precisely what establishes that you were doing what you say you were doing when you say you were doing it." He looked up. "Can I take this with me to review tonight?" "Keep it," she said. "I have another." He almost smiled. "Of course you do." The letter from Thomas Dunnigan arrived 9 days before the hearing. It came on a Wednesday, by special post from Helena, and Jessup had clearly written something that carried weight. Because Dunnigan's reply was 3 pages in a hand that was slightly trembling at the edges, but precise in its content. He remembered the registration clearly, remembered the day, remembered Elias Blackwood, remembered Thomas Alderman's survey documentation and the clerk's office, and the fact that it had been a spring morning because he'd ridden in from a property visit the day before, and the mud on his boots had still been damp when he signed his name. He was 76 years old and not in the best health, but he was in Helena, and Helena was a day's ride, and he was, in his own words, not so far gone that I would allow the truth to be misrepresented in a court of law when I have breath enough to correct it. She read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, alone, before Ethan came in from the morning rounds. She handed it to him without preamble and watched him read it. His face did the thing it had done in Billings, in the county recorder's office, that older-than-his-years look, carrying the weight of what the paper represented beyond itself. "He'll come," Ethan said. "He'll come," she confirmed. He set the letter down and looked at it on the table. "My father would have—" He stopped, started again. "My father spent 30 years building something. He was careful about it in a way that I didn't always understand when I was young. I thought careful was slow. I thought the way he documented everything and kept records and made sure the right people witnessed the right things was excessive." He paused. "He was building a defense he never expected to need. Most careful people are," she said. "They just don't call it that." He looked at her. "You would have understood him." "Maybe," she said. "I understand that kind of thinking because it's the kind I do." She picked up the letter and put it carefully in the folder with everything else. "We should tell Caulfield today. I'll ride to town and send a wire." He went, and she stood in the kitchen with the folder and the particular feeling that something built over many weeks was now approaching the test of whether it would hold, which was always the hardest moment. Not the building, not even the fight, but the instant before you found out whether what you'd made was strong enough. Well, the night before the hearing, she didn't sleep well. She'd expected this and hadn't been able to prevent it. She lay in the room at the back of the house with the east-facing window and listened to the ranch settling into its night sounds, the creak of the structure in the cold, the distant sound of an animal somewhere in the dark, the wind finding the gaps it always found. And her mind refused to do what she needed it to do, which was rest. She got up at 3 in the morning and went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table in the dark with her hands around the cup and went through everything one more time. Not the documents, she'd memorized those. The people. Caulfield in his hotel in Harlan Creek, presumably sleeping with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times. Jessup in his house with the green roof, already committed. Dunnigan, who had arrived yesterday on the stage from Helena, looking smaller than she'd imagined but clear-eyed, and whom she'd met at Mabel's over coffee for 30 minutes while Ethan spoke with Caulfield. and who had looked at her with the assessing look of an elderly man who has lived long enough to know which people to trust, and had nodded once and said, "You found all of this." "It was already there," she'd said. "That's not the same thing," he'd said, which was what she'd said to Ethan about the certified copy being accurate versus good, and she'd felt the particular small shock of having her own observation returned to her from an unexpected direction. She sat at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning and drank her tea and thought about the gap in the argument that Kane's lawyers were going to exploit. She'd been thinking about it for 2 weeks. She knew what it was. It was her. Her presence. Her involvement. Her history. She was the weakest point in their own case. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she was the newest element, the one that couldn't be corroborated by the same depth of documentation that corroborated everything else. She'd written to James's lawyer in Ohio and to Margaret Holt, who had managed the accounts at the hardware business for 6 of the 7 years Claire had worked there. She'd sent both letters the day Caulfield asked for them. Margaret had responded quickly. 3 pages, warm and precise, describing Claire's competence and her role in the business in terms that were useful and specific and signed with Margaret's characteristic decisive handwriting. The lawyer, whose name was Gordon Fitch, had sent a shorter letter that was more formal but equally clear. Claire had been the operational intelligence of the Whitmore business. Her records were impeccable. Her integrity was not in question. Both letters were in the folder. She'd read them more times than she should have, for reasons she wasn't fully examining, because having people say accurate things about you in writing was a different experience than simply knowing those things yourself. At some point past 4, she heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up, and Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed, not in his work clothes, but in the clothes he wore for town, which were cleaner lines and less weathered, and which made him look slightly unfamiliar, the way people look when you've grown used to one version of them. He looked at her, then at the tea. He went to the stove without a word and put the kettle on. "What are you doing up?" she asked. "Same as you." He leaned against the counter and waited for the water. "Running through it. We have everything we need." "I know. Caulfield is good." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Then what are you running through?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stove. "I keep thinking about what happens if it goes wrong," he said. "Not strategically, personally." He glanced at her. "This ranch is what my father built, and what I've spent 10 years maintaining, and I have never had anyone stand beside me in this the way you have. And I keep thinking about the fact that if this goes wrong, I lose both things at once." The kitchen was quiet. The kettle began to heat. She looked at her tea, then at him. "We're not going to lose," she said. "You don't know that." "No. But I know what we've built, and I know Caulfield, and I know Jessup and Dunnigan aren't people who can be rattled on a witness stand." She set down her cup. "And I know that Kane came to this gate in person because he was afraid. Men who are winning don't show up in person to warn you." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not really what I was talking about," he said. She held his gaze and didn't look away, because she'd gotten better at that over the past weeks, and because whatever he was talking about, he'd said it out loud, and the least she owed him was to hear it. "I know," she said. The kettle started to make noise. He poured the water and brought the cup to the table and sat down across from her, in the chair that had become his chair at this table over the past 2 months, the one with the slight wobble in the back left leg that neither of them had gotten around to fixing. They sat across from each other in the 3 in the morning kitchen with 2 cups of tea between them and the hearing 8 hours away, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was the right thing, and they both knew it was the right thing, and it was enough. The county courthouse in Harlan Creek was a single-story building of red brick with a courtroom that held perhaps 60 people and smelled of old wood and lamp oil and the accumulated weight of decisions made in it. It was full when they arrived. She hadn't expected that. Hadn't anticipated that people would come, that word would have traveled far enough, and the case would have become interesting enough to draw the town in on a cold Thursday morning. She saw Mabel near the back. She saw Darren and 2 other ranch hands in the middle rows, which meant they'd ridden in at dawn. She saw Gus standing against the side wall with his hat in his hands, and the expression he always wore, which communicated nothing and everything simultaneously. Victor Kane was already seated at the opposing table when they came in. He was in a dark suit, and he had 2 lawyers with him and 3 other men whose function was not obvious but whose presence was. He looked at Ethan when they entered. He looked at Claire with the same brief, slightly dismissive attention he'd given her at the gate, and she gave him the same level, attentive nothing in return. Caulfield had been there since before them, arranging the documentation on the table with the precise, unhurried manner that characterized everything he did. He looked at Claire when she sat down and said quietly, "Dunnigan is in the room behind the judge's chamber. Jessup came in an hour ago. They're both steady." She nodded and looked at the folder between them on the table. She touched the edge of it once, just to feel that it was there, and then put her hands in her lap. The judge was a man named Horace Callum, in his late 60s, with the expression of someone who had presided over a great many things and had learned not to be impressed by any of them. He came in and sat and looked around the courtroom once with eyes that didn't miss anything, and called the hearing to order in a voice that exactly fit the room. Kane's lead lawyer, a man named Pierce from Billings, with a silver watch chain and a voice built for projecting, opened by characterizing the case as straightforward, an attempt by a ranch operation in declining financial health to obstruct a legitimate business acquisition by manufacturing claims to water rights that had been superseded by subsequent legal development. He said the word manufacturing with a careful precision that let it suggest what it was meant to suggest without saying it directly. Claire listened without reacting. She'd heard this framing before in the weeks of preparation, had helped Caulfield anticipate it and answer it, and hearing it delivered live in a courtroom with 60 people listening was not easier than imagining it, but it wasn't harder either. It was simply the thing that was happening now. Pierce then said that the documents offered by the Blackwood operation had been located and assembled by an individual with no verifiable standing in the territory, no documented history in Montana prior to her employment at the ranch, and a personal interest in the outcome of the case that rendered her objectivity questionable. He said all of this without once saying her name, which she recognized as deliberate, which she recognized as a strategy to make her smaller than she was. Caulfield presented the case with the methodical quiet that had made him exactly the right choice for this. He walked through this timeline from Elias Blackwood's registration in 1879 to the certified copy obtained in Billings, laying each piece of documentation in sequence, explaining its significance without dramatics, connecting each element to the next with the patient clarity of someone who understood that the truth was most powerful when it didn't need decoration. He called Jessup first. The old man took the stand with the careful movement of someone whose body had been requiring more negotiation lately, but he sat down in the witness chair and looked at the courtroom with the clear, certain eyes of a man who had been waiting 81 years for the precise opportunity to tell the truth about something that mattered. Pierce's cross-examination tried 3 angles: that Jessup's memory was unreliable at his age, that the seal he'd identified could have been reproduced, and that his personal regard for the Blackwood family compromised his objectivity. Jessup answered all 3 with the flatness of a man who considered these arguments insufficiently serious to be offended by. "I processed that registration myself," he said, to the memory question. "I was 34 years old and in full possession of every faculty I have now, minus the knee, and I remember it because it was my job to remember it, and I was good at my job. On the seal, I worked beside Thomas Alderman for 6 years. I have seen that mark on several hundred documents. I am telling you that mark is genuine. On the objectivity question, I have no financial interest in this matter. I have no property interest. I am here because someone is attempting to take something that doesn't belong to them, and I know for a fact that it doesn't belong to them, and I am 81 years old, and I have very little patience left for dishonesty." There was a sound in the courtroom when Jessup said that. Not laughter, not applause. Something quieter, a collective movement of breath, the sound of a room that has heard something it recognizes as true. Dunnigan was next. He was slower to the stand than Jessup, and his voice was quieter, and Pierce clearly assessed him as the more vulnerable witness, which was the wrong assessment. Dunnigan had spent 50 years in land work. He had spent 50 years in rooms where people tried to tell him what he had or hadn't seen. He had a stillness that came from long practice at exactly this kind of situation. He described the spring morning in 1879 in the county recorder's office in detail that was not dramatic but was specific. The mud on his boots, the clerk's formal script, Alderman's survey documentation spread on the desk. Elias Blackwood signing with the pen the clerk provided because Elias's own pen had run dry. He said this last detail with a slight, precise quality that was the quality of real memory, the kind of specific and slightly absurd peripheral detail that invention never bothered to include. Pierce tried the same angles. Dunnigan's memory, his relationship with the Blackwood family, the question of whether he could truly recall a specific morning 47 years ago. I remember that morning, Dunnigan said, because 3 days later I was involved in a land dispute in Helena that went badly for my client, and for a period of years afterward I went through every registration I had witnessed that spring and verified my recollection of each one. This registration was in my notes. I have those notes still. He looked at the judge. I brought them. The notes were admitted as additional documentation. Caulfield didn't show any expression when they were admitted. He didn't need to. Claire was called to the stand in the afternoon. She'd known this was coming. She'd prepared for it with Caulfield across 2 evenings, going through the questions, practicing not the answers but the manner, staying level, staying specific, not defending herself against implications, but simply answering what was asked and letting the answers be what they were. Pierce began with her background. Ohio. Her husband. The business. Why she'd left. How she'd come to be in Montana. How she'd come to be at Blackwood Ranch. He asked each question with the particular patient precision of a man building something one piece at a time, and she understood what he was building and answered each question directly, without elaboration, and waited for the next one. You have no legal training, he said. That's correct. No formal business education. I managed a business for 7 years. I had no formal education in that either. A pause. He hadn't expected her to turn it that way. She watched him decide whether to pursue it and decide against it. You are employed as a housekeeper at Blackwood Ranch. I manage the household operations, supply procurement, and financial record-keeping for Blackwood Ranch. Yes. A housekeeper. She looked at him steadily. I just described my role. If the word housekeeper is the portion of that description you find most relevant, I can't help you with that. A sound in the courtroom again, quieter than before. The judge didn't intervene. Pierce moved to the documents. When had she first accessed the East Room? What condition were the documents in? Could she be certain they hadn't been altered before she found them? Could the court be certain she hadn't altered them herself? She answered each question with the specific information she had. The date, the condition of the room, Ethan's presence, the copies she'd made and their relationship to the originals, the certified copy from Billings, obtained from a county recorder who had no connection to either party. Then Pierce said, "Isn't it true that you have developed a personal interest in the outcome of this case beyond your employment at Blackwood Ranch?" She looked at him. She knew what the question was doing. Everyone in the room knew what the question was doing. "I have an interest in the truth being established," she said. "I found documentation that proves the truth. I would have the same interest regardless of where I worked." "But you don't work just anywhere. You work at Blackwood Ranch. You've been at this ranch for," he checked his papers, "less than 3 months. That's correct? And in that time you've made substantial changes to ranch operations, inserted yourself into financial decisions, involved yourself in a legal dispute of significant consequence." He looked at her over his papers. "That's quite a great deal for a housekeeper in 3 months." She let the silence sit for one breath. 2. "I've been doing the job I was hired to do," she said. "And when I found information that was important, I brought it to the attention of the man I work for, because that's what an honest person does. The fact that the information turned out to be significant isn't something I engineered." She held Pierce's gaze. "I found the truth in a room nobody had opened in 5 years. I didn't put it there." The room was very quiet. Caulfield's redirect was brief. 3 questions, each one letting her clarify a piece of what Pierce had tried to blur. "When did you first notify Ethan Blackwood of the documents? Who was present? What did you do with the originals?" Her answers were short and specific and left nothing open. When she stepped down from the stand, she walked back to the table and sat down and put her hands in her lap and looked at the judge's bench and breathed. Ethan was called last. He was direct and factual, and he confirmed every point of the documentation's provenance with the quiet certainty of a man who knew his own ranch and his own family's history. When Pierce asked him whether he'd known about the documents prior to Claire Whitmore's arrival, he said no. When Pierce asked whether he'd directed her to find them, he said no. When Pierce asked whether her involvement in ranch decisions had been sanctioned by him, he said yes, clearly and without qualification. "She runs this ranch better than it's been run in years," he said. "That's not relevant to the water rights question, but since you've made it a subject, I'll answer it directly." Pierce didn't have a follow-up for that. Judge Callum took a recess of 40 minutes. 60 people sat in the courtroom and waited, and it was the longest 40 minutes Claire had experienced since the weeks after James died, and she'd been waiting to understand what her life was going to become. She didn't look at Kane across the room. She looked at the folder on the table and the window behind the judge's bench, and at Caulfield's hands, which were perfectly still, which she found steadying. Ethan was beside her, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, the same steadiness she'd felt on the porch steps and in the east room and at the fire beside the creek, the particular quality of a person who was afraid and not pretending otherwise and holding steady anyway. She didn't say anything, and neither did he. They sat and waited together in the way that people wait when what's coming will either hold or break everything they've built, and there's nothing left to do but find out which. Judge Callum returned and sat and looked at the courtroom once with the eyes that missed nothing. He looked at his notes. He looked up. The documentation presented by the Blackwood estate is consistent, corroborated, and chronologically sound, he said. The water rights registered to Elias Blackwood in 1879 are established by the original county record, confirmed by 2 living witnesses with direct knowledge of the registration, and supported by certified survey documentation bearing a verified official seal. He paused. The arguments presented by the Three Rivers Cattle Company regarding authentication and chain of custody have not been substantiated by evidence sufficient to overcome this record. The court finds in favor of Blackwood Ranch. She heard the room. She heard Mabel, near the back, make a sound that was not subtle. She heard one of the ranch hands, Pete's voice, younger and less restrained than the others, say something she didn't catch but understood from the tone. She heard, or thought she heard, a sound from the direction of Darren that was short and contained but real. She didn't move. She sat at the table with her hands in her lap and looked at the judge's bench and felt the verdict settle over her the way something large and slow settles when it finally comes to rest. Beside her, Ethan put his hand on the table. Not on her hand, beside it, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. A quiet, contained thing. Not performed for the room, just present. Kane left without speaking to anyone. His lawyers gathered their papers with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to losing gracefully in public and making other arrangements in private. She watched them go and thought about what Caulfield had said 2 nights ago, that a legal defeat for Kane in open court would cost him more than the water rights, would cost him the reputation of invincibility that had made other landowners reluctant to fight him. She hoped that was true. She thought it probably was. Caulfield gathered the documents from the table methodically, in the same order he'd laid them out, and put them in his case. "Congratulations," he said to Ethan. To Claire he said, "Your testimony was clear and well controlled. The notebook made a difference." He paused. "You have very good instincts for this kind of work." She didn't know quite what to do with that, so she simply said, "Thank you," and meant it. Jessup was waiting in the aisle when they came through the gate in the bar. He looked at Claire with the clear eyes and said nothing, but he extended his hand and she shook it, which was not a thing she'd expected, and received it for what it was. A recognition, plain and dignified, from a man who dispensed them rarely. Dunnigan was behind him. He shook Ethan's hand and then turned to Claire and said simply, "Elias would have been glad you found those papers." She couldn't answer that with anything that was sufficient, so she nodded, once, and he seemed to understand that was answer enough. Outside the courthouse, the cold air was the most welcome thing she'd breathed in weeks. She stood on the steps while the crowd came out around her, and she looked at the main street of Harlan Creek in the flat December light, the feed store and the hotel and Mabel's diner and the stage road running north. And she thought about the morning she'd arrived on that stage with her bag and the folded advertisement and the particular suspended quality of a life that is waiting to find out what it's going to become. She didn't feel suspended anymore. That was what she noticed, standing on the courthouse steps in the cold. She felt placed. She felt like someone standing on solid ground, which was different from feeling safe, different from feeling certain. It was specifically the feeling of ground, of a place that held you because you'd earned your place in it. Ethan came to stand beside her on the steps. He didn't say anything immediately, and she didn't either, and the town did what it did around them, ordinary and ongoing, indifferent to the thing that had just happened inside. "It's over," he said, finally. "The legal part," she said. He looked at her. "What other part is there?" She looked at the street, at the bare winter trees along the main road, at the sky that was the color it always was in Montana in December. That particular gray-white that wasn't quite clouds and wasn't quite clear, that occupied the space between weather and not weather with a Montana indifference to resolution. "The part where we figure out what comes next," she said. He was quiet. The courthouse door opened behind them, and people came out and went around them, and the cold moved steadily in from the north. "I have some thoughts about that," he said. She looked at him. Not sideways, not at the space beside the expression she'd been avoiding, directly. "So do I," she said. They stood on the courthouse steps, and the cold held steady, and the town went on around them, and whatever came next was still ahead, still unformed, still waiting to be built the same way everything worth having had been built. One careful, honest, well-documented step at a time. They rode back to Blackwood Ranch in the late afternoon, when the light had gone sideways and thin, and the shadows ran long across the frozen ground. The horses knew the way home and didn't require much direction, which was good because neither of them was paying particular attention to directing them. The cold was steady and honest, the same cold it had been all week, and she rode with her coat buttoned and her hands loose on the reins and let the motion of the horse carry her through the last miles, the way you let something physical do the work when your mind has been doing it alone for too long. Ethan rode beside her. Not ahead, not behind. Beside. She'd noticed, over the past months, that he was consistent about this in a way she didn't think was conscious. He didn't lead and expect her to follow, didn't fall back into a position that suggested deference or distance. He simply rode beside her, the way people ride when they're going to the same place with equal claim to the destination. The ranch came into view in the last of the light. She saw it the way she'd seen it the first morning. The 3 stories of dressed timber and river stone, the covered porch, the outbuildings arranged behind. But the feeling it produced now was nothing like the first morning. The first morning it had been a proposition. Now it was something she didn't have a clean word for, something that existed between belonging and being needed, which she'd learned over the course of her life were not always the same thing, but which, here, had become difficult to separate. Pete was at the gate when they came through, and he took the horses without being asked and said, without looking up from the reins, "Gus made something. Kitchen." Which was Pete's version of welcome home, and also his version of we heard and were glad, and she understood it as both. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Gus had made a stew that was better than his usual standard, which meant he'd been paying attention to something she'd said 3 weeks ago about the proportion of root vegetables to broth, and had applied it without telling her he had, which was the way Gus did most things. Darren was at the table, which surprised her. Darren ate in the bunkhouse as a rule, and his presence in the kitchen was a departure that meant something. He looked at her when she came in. He didn't say anything elaborate. He said, "Good result today." And then he looked back at his bowl. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. She sat down and ate and felt the warmth of the kitchen work its way into her hands and her back, and the place behind her eyes that had been tense for 18 days. The men ate and talked about the ordinary things. The north fence, the cattle numbers, a weather pattern Gus had been watching that suggested snow before the week was out. The conversation moved around her and she let it, and it felt like something she was part of, rather than something she was observing, which was different from how it had felt in the early weeks, and the difference was not small. Ethan sat at the end of the table and ate and was quiet, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking past the current moment, and she didn't press it. Whatever he was thinking, he'd say it when he was ready, and she had learned, was still learning because it was a harder lesson than it should have been, that waiting for people to be ready was not weakness, it was accuracy. After supper, she cleaned up, and the men filed out, and the kitchen settled into its evening quiet, and she was at the counter going over the next week's supply list when Ethan came back in. He'd been outside, she could tell from the cold still on his coat, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, and she kept her eyes on the supply list and gave him the space to say whatever he'd come back in to say. "I want to show you something," he said. She put the list down and followed him through the house and up the stairs, past the second floor and up to the third, and down the corridor to the east room. He pushed the door open, and she saw it transformed from what it had been. The boxes still there, but organized now, the floor cleared, the shelves making sense. They'd done this together over 3 weeks of evenings, sorting and cataloging, and the room that had been accumulated chaos was now something that could be used. He crossed to the window, the one that faced east, the same direction as her room below, and looked out at the dark, and she came to stand beside him. "My father used to come up here," Ethan said. "When I was young, I'd ask him what he was doing, and he'd say he was looking at what he'd built." He looked at the dark window. "I thought that was a strange thing to do. Look at dark." "It's not dark," she said. "You're looking at the land. You know it's there." He turned his head slightly toward her. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." They stood at the window, and below them the ranch was quiet and dark and present. All of it. The fields and the outbuildings and the water channels running toward the northern pasture, and the cattle settled into their cold weather stillness, and the frozen ground that was Blackwood ground, registered and documented and defended and still here. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right." He turned from the window. In the dim light of the single lamp he'd brought up, his face was the most honest she'd ever seen it. Not because he was performing honesty, but because there was nothing left to arrange over it. The careful, controlled expression was gone. What was under it was simply him, tired and relieved and carrying something he'd been carrying for a while that he'd decided tonight to put down. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I want you to stay. Not as someone who works here, as someone who—" He stopped, started again. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this for 6 weeks, and I haven't found it. So I'm going to say the direct version and trust that you'll understand what I mean, even if the words aren't exactly right." She waited. "I have spent 10 years on this ranch being alone in the specific way that people are alone when they've stopped expecting anything different," he said. "And then you arrived and you were honest with me from the first week, and you fought for this place like it was yours, and it made me—" He stopped again. Something in his jaw worked. "It made me want it to actually be yours, permanently, in every way that matters." The lamp threw its circle of light against the floor, and the dark held everything outside the window, and she stood in the east room of Blackwood Ranch and let herself hear what he'd said without immediately doing anything with it. She'd known it was coming. She'd known it for weeks. The way you know something that you've been watching approach from a distance, and knowing it was coming had not, it turned out, made it easier to be standing in front of it. Because the thing about being asked for something real by someone who meant it was that it required you to be real in return, and being real required you to look at yourself clearly, which was always harder than looking at anything else. "I came here with nothing," she said. "Not as a deflection, as a beginning. I know. I came here because I needed work and a roof and distance from a life that had stopped working. Those were my reasons." She looked at him steadily. "They weren't bad reasons, but they weren't—" She paused. "They weren't you." "No," he said. "They weren't. And somewhere between the ledger and the East Room and Billings and that courtroom today, something changed." She said it simply, because it was simply true, and she'd spent enough of her life dressing truth up in protective language that she recognized the habit and was tired of it. "I don't know exactly when. That bothers me slightly. I like knowing when things happen." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. The thing just before a smile that is sometimes better than the smile itself. "Claire," he said, just her name. The same weight he'd given it in the kitchen the night before the hearing. That particular weight that was not commanding and not asking, but something between the two that she still didn't have a word for. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, to which part?" "To staying," she said. "To the permanent version of it. To whatever that means for two people who are both slightly difficult and not particularly young, and have both lost things and are still here anyway." She held his gaze. "Yes to all of it." He crossed the distance between them and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with the kind of gesture that announces itself, just took her hand in both of his the way you hold something you've been worried about losing. And she felt the warmth of it, the realness of it, the specific gravity of a person who was not performing care, but simply had it. "I'm not easy," he said. "I know that. I work too much and I'm stubborn, and I don't always say things when I should say them." "I know all of those things," she said. "I've been watching you for 3 months. And?" She looked at him. "I'm not easy either," she said. "I keep notebooks about everything, and I argue when I think I'm right, and I'm terrible at accepting help. And I've been alone long enough that I've developed habits that aren't going to be simple to share space with." "I know all of those things," he said. "I've been watching you for 3 months." The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from somewhere, and the light shifted and steadied, and outside the east window the dark held the land she'd helped to keep. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in this town with a worn leather bag and a folded advertisement and nothing else. And she thought about all the different kinds of nothing that something could grow from if you paid attention and did the work and refused, when it mattered most, to walk away from it. They married in February, when the worst of the winter had peaked, and the days had begun their slow, almost imperceptible tilt back toward light. It was not a large event. Harlan Creek's Justice of the Peace, a steady man named Albright, who treated the occasion with appropriate seriousness and no unnecessary flourish. The kitchen afterward, with the people who had earned the right to be there, Gus and Darren and Pete, and a few of the other hands who had seen the whole of it unfold, and whose presence meant something precisely because it was unforced. Mabel brought food she hadn't been asked to bring, and set it out with the matter-of-fact generosity of a woman who expressed care through logistics, which Claire recognized as her own language, and was glad to receive it. Jessup came. She hadn't been certain he would manage the ride in February, but he came, driven by Pete in the ranch wagon, and he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and watched the room with the clear eyes that missed nothing. And at one point he caught her looking at him from across the kitchen, and he raised his cup slightly, which was the entirety of his toast, and was sufficient. Dunnigan had sent a letter from Helena. It was short and characteristically precise, and it said, among other things, that he had told his daughter about the case and about the woman who had found the documents, and his daughter had said it sounded like the kind of story worth telling. He hoped the ranch would continue to prosper. He expected it would, given the people in it. She kept the letter. She kept most things, which Ethan was learning. Spring came the way it always came to that part of Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in a series of negotiations between the cold that had held all winter and the warmth that was gradually, stubbornly insisting on itself. The ground thawed, and then refroze, and then thawed again. And the water channels ran higher as the snowpack released from the upper elevations, and Blackwood Creek moved through its banks with the particular authority of water that knows where it belongs. She stood at the window of the east room on a morning in April and watched the northern pasture coming back to itself. The grass coming in, the cattle moving with the ease of animals returned to adequate grazing. And she thought about what Ethan had said months ago, about his father standing at this window looking at the dark, knowing the land was there. She understood it differently now than she had the night he'd said it. She understood it as something larger than sentiment, larger than the pleasure of ownership. It was the knowledge that what you had built was real and would be there tomorrow, that it didn't depend on the goodwill of people who wished you ill, that the foundation was documented and witnessed and legally established and tested in a courtroom and had held. That kind of knowledge changed the way you looked at the dark. It changed what you could see in it. Ethan came to stand beside her. He did this regularly now. Sought out whatever window she was at, stood beside her, and looked at the same thing she was looking at. She'd come to understand it as his version of sharing a thought without requiring words for it, which was one of the things about him she hadn't expected to find as easy as she did. "The East Field needs reseeding," he said. "I know. I put it in the spring schedule." "The schedule you made in February." "The one I updated last week, yes." He looked at her with the expression that was no longer the one she'd spent months avoiding. It had become simply his expression, the one that meant he was seeing her clearly and without reservation, which had stopped being difficult to look at, and had become, instead, the thing she looked for when she needed to remember where she was. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered the question. Outside, the northern pasture was doing what it did in April, slow and determined and unglamorous. The cattle moved in the way cattle moved, without urgency, without drama, simply going from one place to the next, because that was what the day required. "I'm thinking about what it costs to stay somewhere," she said, "when leaving would be easier." He was quiet, waiting. "I've left things," she said. "Ohio. The life I thought I was going to have. I left because staying would have meant disappearing, and I wasn't willing to do that." She looked at the pasture. The difference here was that staying didn't require me to disappear. Staying required me to be more present than I'd been in years. She paused. "That's harder, actually. Being present. It requires you to risk more." "Did you?" he asked. "Risk more than you'd planned to." She thought about the east room in the middle of the night, the documents on the floor between them. The creek crossing in December, the fire and the honest dark. The courthouse steps, the cold, his hand beside hers on the table. 3 months of daily work and small decisions, and the slow, unannounced accumulation of something she hadn't come here looking for and wouldn't trade now for anything the previous version of her life had held. Yes, she said, considerably more. Was it worth it? She looked at him. She thought about all the things she'd lost and all the things that had grown in the space the losses left, the way certain plants only grow in disturbed ground, the way difficulty is sometimes the only condition under which particular kinds of strength develop. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach with the worn bag and the folded advertisement and the absolute determination to keep going, who hadn't known what she was going to find at the end of the road and had kept going anyway. "Ask me in 20 years, she said. He looked at her for a moment, then, "I plan to." Outside, the water moved through the channels it had always moved through, doing what water did, finding the lowest point, following the path that had been cut for it by years of patient insistence, carrying everything it needed to carry from one place to the next without announcing itself, without drama, simply present and necessary and permanent in the way that only the most fundamental things are permanent. The land held it. The land had always held it. And now there were papers in a locked box in the ranch office that said so, signed and sealed and witnessed and proven, and the man who had tried to take it was gone, and the woman who had helped find the proof was standing at an east-facing window with her husband in the April morning watching the ground come back to life. She had not come here to save anything. She had come here to survive, which was a smaller ambition and a more honest one, and survival had led her somewhere she hadn't planned, the way it sometimes does when you're paying attention. She had worked, and she had looked, and she had refused to look away from things that were difficult. And what she'd found, at the end of all that looking, was a place that needed what she had to give, and a person who could see her clearly enough to know it. That was not a small thing. She had learned over the course of a life that had required considerable learning that it was in fact among the largest things there were, to be seen accurately by someone who has no reason to flatter you, and to be wanted anyway. Not despite the difficulty. Not overlooking the edges. Fully, with complete information, in the knowledge that what they're choosing is exactly what you are. The East Room still held the smell of old paper and winter dust, and the ranch was doing its April work outside the window. And Ethan stood beside her the way he stood beside her now, consistently, without ceremony, as though it were simply the obvious place to be. And she thought that this was what people meant when they talked about coming home, though the word had never felt accurate to her before because the homes she'd had before had been places she'd arrived at, and this was a place she'd built. You could not take what a person had built with their own hands by standing at a gate and making threats. You could not dismiss what someone knew by calling them only what they did. You could not win against the truth by spending enough money to deny it. If the truth had been documented carefully, witnessed honestly, and defended by people who had decided that what was right mattered more than what was easy. She had always believed this, in the way you believe things that haven't yet been tested. Now she knew it, which was different, heavier and less theoretical, earned through 18 days of preparation and a courtroom morning and 40 minutes of waiting to find out if the thing they'd built was strong enough to stand. It had been. It was. The water ran in the channels below the window. The cattle moved in the field. Somewhere behind them, the ranch was waking into its day. The ordinary sounds of work beginning, voices calling across the yard, the structure of a place that knew what it was and what it was for. She turned from the window. There was a supply order to finish, and a fence schedule to review, and a letter to write to Margaret Holt in Ohio, who had asked in her last correspondence how Claire was getting on in Montana, and to whom Claire had not yet written the full answer because the full answer had been still unfinished. It was finished now. She went to write it.